James Morrison's fingers curled on the divorce documents. The pricey paper crinkled in his grip as he watched the sprinklers soak his clothes, which were spread across the grass. Each drop of water triggered another recollection. His favorite blue dress shirt from their anniversary meal in Paris. The custom-tailored outfit from their previous Christmas celebration. Rebecca had given him a silk tie when he established Biotech Solutions. The mechanical clicking of the sprinklers set a constant pace for his racing thoughts. He had diligently maintained this lawn for 15 years, spending countless Sunday mornings making sure every blade of grass was immaculate, just as Rebecca had wished. It now served as a platform for his public humiliation, still standing there like a lost puppy. Rebecca's voice interrupted his thoughts. She stood at the entryway of their colonial-style home. Now it's her house, her manicured fingers linked with Richard Sterling's. The real estate magnate's appearance alongside her was like a well-planned insult. His designer clothing had an unnaturally white smile. Speaking about old money and privilege, James examined Richard's face, noticing a small sag in his jowls that his pricey skincare routine could not completely conceal. Despite his neatly groomed salt and pepper hair, age spots began to appear, betraying his true age. Richard Sterling, 45, conducted himself with the arrogance of inherited money. Though James had done his homework, the Sterling empire was constructed on quicksand, leveraged properties, dubious permits, and enough debt to drown a small nation. "You should thank me, James." Rebecca's voice was dripping with phony pity. Her scarlet lips curved into a trained smile. "I'm being more than generous. I am not taking any money from you." She paused. Her next remarks were planned for maximum impact. "God knows you don't have any to spare." James remained mute, his thoughts meticulously documenting every detail of the situation. Rebecca's fingers clasped Richard's arm with smug delight in her gaze, and the little trembling in her voice revealed her uneasiness beneath her confident appearance. 6 months of betrayal played out in his memory like a well-edited film. The unexpected emergency meetings, weekend business travels, and the deliberate emptying of their joint accounts. He'd also been blind, preoccupied with his work at Biotech Solutions, to trusting in their 15-year relationship. 18-hour days in the lab had left him susceptible and preoccupied by the time he'd recognized the symptoms. Rebecca had already carried out her leaving strategy. James whispered gently, "The papers have been signed." Rebecca's smile faltered somewhat as he spoke with a disturbing calmness. "You got exactly what you wanted." Richard's laugh boomed across the yard, false and hollow. He drew Rebecca closer, his fine watch gleaming in the morning sunlight. "Face it, Morrison, you are a nobody. Always has been, always will be." His voice tightened. "Now leave my property before I call the police." James raised an eyebrow, the first genuine reaction he'd made at your property. "Wedding gift?" Rebecca interrupted, her smile expanding. "Richard purchased it last week. Isn't it quite generous of him?" James nodded slowly. His gaze never left their faces. He remembered every detail, including Rebecca's small flush of triumph, Richard's possessive hand resting on her waist, and the casual cruelty of their shared laughing. These revelations would motivate him in the months ahead. Walking to his Honda Civic, the single asset Rebecca had graciously left him, James felt their gaze on his back, waiting for him to crack and exhibit signs of failure. Obviously, the car was a purposeful insult. Rebecca could have stolen it, but she chose to leave it as a reminder of his fall from grace. Inside the car, James took out his phone. His fingers remained calm as he called a number he had learned weeks earlier. "Dr. Patterson, this is James Morrison." He paused and listened to the reaction. "Yes, I have made a decision. Tell the board that I accept their offer." Another pause. "But I have one condition. Until the transaction is completed, all information is kept strictly confidential." As he terminated the call, James noticed Rebecca and Richard in his rearview mirror. They stood in the entryway of his old home, their poses reminiscent of a high-end real estate advertising. A wonderful couple in their perfect home. But James looked behind the veneer. He spotted hairline flaws in their armor, weaknesses they were unaware of. His hands grabbed the steering wheel as he backed away from the curb. His mind was already rushing ahead to the next stage of his plan. They believed they had broken him, reduced him to nothing. They'd quickly realize how perilous it was to underestimate James Morrison. The Honda engine protested as he accelerated, but James didn't notice. His thoughts were already elsewhere, planning out the next moves like a chess grandmaster. Rebecca and Richard had done well in their game, but they had overlooked one important thing. Sometimes the most deadly opponent is one who appears to have nothing to lose. James smiled slightly as he drove near his temporary abode. They taught him important lessons about trust, devotion, and the true character of humans. It was now time to demonstrate that he had been an excellent student. The buzzing of his phone interrupted his thoughts. Rebecca's text left some of your valuable research notes in the garage. We'll have them carted to the dump tomorrow. Consider that a final goodbye gift. James did not respond. He did not need to. Regardless, the notes were decoys. He'd placed carefully produced fakes weeks before, when he first uncovered their affair. The true research, the breakthrough that would transform everything, was securely stored in numerous locations. Rebecca and Richard assumed they were dealing with a naive scientist who was too preoccupied with his job to see their betrayal coming. They never cared to dig deeper, to reveal the steel beneath the lab coat. He parked into the parking lot of his new apartment complex, a purposefully modest structure that fit their view of his financial situation. Another element of the complicated game he was creating. Let them believe they had reduced him to living in a second-rate flat. Allow them to assume their victory is complete. Inside his flat, James stood in the barren living room, surrounded by boxes that he had not bothered to unpack. He did not need to. This location was transient. Just like their win, he took out his laptop and started typing, his fingers speeding over the keys as he captured every detail of the day's happenings. Each remark added to the basis of his vengeance. A notification appeared on his screen, and communication from his lawyer verifying the transfer of his remaining assets to various shell firms. Rebecca's thorough pillaging of their joint accounts had actually worked in his favor, giving an ideal cover for his personal financial activities. She'd been so concentrated on making everything visible that she'd forgotten to look for what was concealed. James shut the laptop and walked to the window, gazing out at the metropolitan skyline. Rebecca and Richard were most likely enjoying their victory by sipping expensive champagne and laughing at his expense. Let them chuckle. Allow them to enjoy their moment of triumph. He had learned from them. I learned about patience, timing, and the value of being weak while you are powerful. However, he was not motivated by greed or lust, as they were. His motivation was purer and more focused. They tried to demolish everything he had built and toiled for. They would now learn the consequences of their arrogance. The sun was lowering over the city as James began his next round of calls. Each conversation was brief and focused, setting the framework for what was to come. By the time darkness fell, the pieces were in action. Rebecca and Richard had won the first battle, but they had no idea the fight had only just started. In their arrogance, they'd made their own worst opponent, a man who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. A man who would demonstrate just how costly disloyalty might be. 3 months before the divorce papers arrived, James Morrison sat across from Dr. Catherine Patterson in his lab at Biotech Solutions. I observed her expression shift as she studied his study results. The head of research at PharmaCorp, one of the country's top pharmaceutical corporations, showed in unannounced that morning. Her arrival caused ripples of suspicion across the little startup. "This is Dr. Patterson," halted. Her eyes were examining the data for the third time. "This is revolutionary, James. The delivery technology you created has the potential to revolutionize targeted cancer therapy." She looked up at him, her professional composure faltering slightly, revealing real surprise. "How did you keep this under wraps?" James slumped back in his chair, his lab coat wrinkled from another 18-hour workday. "When everyone believes you're a failure, it's easy to go under the radar." He pointed to the tiny lab around them. "Nobody notices the modest startup running on fumes. Nobody looks too carefully at the scientist who works late hours on what they believe is a dead end." Dr. Patterson placed down the iPad that held his research data. "Do you realize how much this is worth? The possible applications alone." She shakes her head. "When this technology becomes available to the general public, every major pharmaceutical business will compete for it. If it becomes public." James corrects her quietly. "I'm not prepared for it yet. There are still tests to run and procedures to validate." He hesitated, carefully considering his next words. In addition, there are personal considerations to consider, personal issues. Dr. Patterson's eyes narrowed slightly. She hadn't gotten to her position by ignoring minor indications. James stood and proceeded to the lab's small window, which overlooked the parking lot, where Rebecca's BMW parked next to his Honda. "Let's just say that time is everything, Dr. Patterson, both in science and in life." The discussion went to technical specifics, dosage rates, delivery techniques, and probable adverse effects. But during the conversation, James could see the wheels turning behind Dr. Patterson's professional mask. She was not simply judging the science, she was evaluating him. That night, Dr. Patterson left with a non-disclosure agreement and the promise to continue their conversation. James sat alone in his lab, performing another round of simulations. Rebecca had sent him a text message, "Working late again. Do not wait." "Meeting with clients," he replied, "is simple." "Okay." Knowing she wouldn't be meeting clients, the private investigator he'd hired had already confirmed her customary Wednesday night appointment with Richard Sterling at the Madison Hotel, where they had, ironically, celebrated their 10th wedding anniversary 3 years before. James went back to his computer. The blue light from the screen reflected off his spectacles as he analyzed the preliminary trial results. The results were far better than he had expected. The tailored delivery system was not only effective, it was a novel cancer treatment that avoided the catastrophic side effects of standard chemotherapy, precise, efficient, and more significantly, patentable. His phone vibrated again. Rebecca sent another text. "Don't forget to transfer funds for the landscaper. The legal system need improvement." James smiled slightly. Rebecca had just developed an infatuation with the grass, an excuse to slowly drain their joint finances. 10,000 for new sod, 8,000 for a sophisticated irrigation system, another 5,000 for expert landscaping. She believed she was being clever. While he was still focused on his work, she was planning her escape route. Rebecca had no idea that James had been planning for every withdrawal she made. Each account she drained was meticulously documented. Every business encounter with Richard Sterling was documented and time-stamped. Every fraudulent loan application she assisted with at Sterling Properties was archived. The next morning, James arrived early at the lab to study the previous night's security footage. He had installed the cameras personally, and they were discreetly hidden throughout the complex. The official motive was to preserve his research. The real reason was to document what occurred after hours, right on schedule. The video showed Rebecca entering the lab at 11:47 p.m., using the key she had insisted on having in case of an emergency. She went straight to his office and spent 20 minutes looking through his files and photographing things with her phone. James turned to another camera angle, watching as she transferred files from his computer to a USB drive. The computer, of course, was a ruse, carrying only outdated research material and purposefully false results. The true discovery was made elsewhere, safeguarded behind encryption that would make government agencies envy. His telephone rang. "It's Dr. Patterson again." "James, I have spoken with the board. They are interested." "Very interested. However, they must be familiar with your terms." James viewed the video of Rebecca leaving his laboratory. Her look was triumphant as she gripped the USB disk. $500 million, Dr. Patterson. Non-negotiable, plus a leadership position in the research division. After the acquisition was completed, there was a pause on the other end of the line. That is aggressive. "It's fair," James said calmly. "You have seen the data. Do you know how much this technology is worth? $500 million is actually a conservative estimate given the market potential." Another pause. "The board will seek independent verification of the results. Naturally, I will provide access to all trial data, but everything will be kept strictly discreet until the transaction is completed. No public statements or SEC filings. There was nothing that could tip our hand. You are concerned about rival offerings." James considered Rebecca and Richard, and their arrogant belief that they were always the sharpest individuals in the room. "No, Dr. Patterson. I'm concerned about those who may try to disrupt the transaction for personal reasons." After hanging up the phone, James looked up the most recent report from his private investigator. Richard Sterling's empire was just as James had suspected. A house of cards built with leveraged properties and illegal loans. The man presented himself as old money, yet his affluence was as phony as his nicely capped teeth. More crucially, Rebecca was deeply involved in the scam while working as a loan officer at First National. She'd been assisting Richard in securing funding by using the same homes as security for several loans. It was brilliant, but it was also quite illegal. James leaned back in his chair, considering his next move. The parts were all in place. The breakthrough technology and the acquisition provide evidence of fraud. Now it was simply a matter of timing. His PC buzzed with an email message. "Rebecca is forwarding an invoice for another landscaping project. The back garden requires work." Her message reads, "I have already authorized the estimate. Only $30,000 for a complete overhaul. James authorized the relocation without hesitation. Let her believe she was winning. Allow her to drain the accounts." Everything she took was simply another piece of proof. Another nail in the coffin she was creating for herself. That evening, he worked late again, knowing Rebecca was going to meet Richard through his contacts. He discovered they were celebrating Richard's newest real estate transaction, a luxury condominium complex located on protected wetlands. The environmental effect studies were concealed. The permissions were expedited by favorable city authorities. James jotted another entry in his growing file. Richard's empire was not solely built on financial deception. It was founded on bribes, fraudulent documentation, and environmental problems. Each piece of evidence was a weapon ready to be used at the right moment. Rebecca sent him another text message, and his phone buzzed. "Don't forget about my charity gala tomorrow night. Where's the blue suit?" James responded with a simple, "Okay," knowing he wouldn't be present. Instead, he planned to meet with Mason Hayes, a former Wall Street analyst who owed him a favor. Years ago, James helped establish Mason was framed for insider trading. They had kept the proof quiet, but it was now time to call in that debt. As James prepared to leave the lab, he noticed his reflection in the window. Rebecca had always critiqued his appearance as too work-focused, too casual, and not polished enough for her social circle. She had never realized that his modest exterior was a skillfully crafted veneer. Rebecca would attend her gala tomorrow on Richard's arm, portraying a sophisticated socialite. She'd laugh with her pals, exchange knowing glances with Richard, and congratulate herself on executing her escape plan flawlessly. And James would be laying the groundwork for their destruction one piece at a time. They assumed they were writing the end of his story. They weren't aware that they were merely setting up the beginning of his chapter, 3 pieces in motion. James was sitting in his lab analyzing the most recent batch of test results when his phone rang with a message from Mason Hayes. The former Wall Street analysts had been working feverishly for the past week to sift through Richard Sterling's complicated web of financial dealings. I discovered something big. Mason's message stated that they needed to meet in person, 1 hour at the usual location. James glanced at his watch. 9:30 p.m. The timing was excellent. Rebecca would attend her monthly yoga session, which was code for her meeting with Richard at the Madison Hotel. Her predictability had become one of his most valuable assets. The customary location was a modest coffee shop in a quiet neighborhood, the type of institution that drew more laptops than discussions. James arrived early and selected a corner table with an excellent view of both entrances. Mason arrived exactly on time. His scruffy appearance contrasted sharply with his brilliance. He carried a tattered leather briefcase that had seen better days, just like its owner. After buying coffee, he sat across from James, his gaze wandering around the practically empty cafe. "You weren't kidding about Sterling Properties," Mason replied quietly, pulling out his laptop. "The whole structure is built on quicksand. Look at this." He turned the screen to face James, presenting a complex diagram of interconnected corporations and properties. James leaned forward to study the facts. "Tell me Richard has used the same properties as security for many loans," Mason said. His fingers flew over the keyboard, bringing up several documents. "He obtains a loan with property as collateral, and then uses the same property as collateral for another loan with a different bank. The documentation is amended just enough to avoid instant notice, and Rebecca plays a role in this." Mason's expression became stern. "She's neck-deep in it. As a loan officer for First National, she has been pushing through bogus applications and manipulating documentation. I discovered at least 12 properties that have been used as collateral more than once. We are talking about hundreds of millions in bogus loans." James nodded carefully, taking in the information. "The banks have not caught on. Sterling has half of the city council in his pocket," Mason responded, pulling out more records. "Building inspectors, zoning officers, and possibly a judge or two. The entire system is greased to look the other way. That relies on their staying in his pocket," James reflected. His imagination is already rushing forward. What happens if money stops flowing? Mason looked up sharply. "That's it, James. It has already started to crack. Sterling is over-leveraged. He is running out of properties to offer as security, and his interest payments are piling up. One incorrect move. One bank becomes suspect, and the entire house of cards collapses." James reclined back and took a drink of his now cold coffee. "How long will it take to assemble all of this evidence? Something that would hold up in court." "Give me 2 weeks," Mason remarked as he closed his laptop. "But James, this is dangerous territory. Sterling has friends in high places. If he figures out what we're doing, he'll stop." James interrupted quietly. "He's too busy celebrating his victory. People like Richard and Rebecca, they never look behind themselves. They're always thinking about their next conquest, their next scheme." After Mason had departed, James placed another call, this time to Isabella Martinez, a feisty investigative writer he had met years before at a tech conference. She'd been attempting to uncover corruption in local real estate development for years, but she'd never found the smoking gun she needed. They met the next day in a tiny park away from their normal hangouts. Isabella had not altered much. I still carried the same worn notebook. She still had that hungry expression in her eyes. That was something all good journalists have. "I'm not looking for vengeance," James informed her. They both realized it wasn't completely accurate. He moved a USB disk across the bench between them. "I am looking for justice. Everything you need is here. Proof of bribery, falsified environmental reports, endangered species surveys, buried to expedite developments." Isabella examined him closely, turning the drive over in her hands. "This is unlike you, James. You've always been the good guy and the peacemaker." "People change," he replied simply. "Sometimes they have to." The remainder of the conference was brief. Professional Isabella would take her time, verify everything independently, create an impenetrable case. James did not need to rush her. The pieces were already in motion. That evening, James returned to his lab to check the most recent results from his cancer treatment studies. The outcomes have continued to exceed expectations. Soon, PharmaCorp would announce the acquisition, causing the first domino to fall. His phone broke. Rebecca sent another text. The landscapers require an additional $10,000 for the water feature. I have already approved it. Try not to work too late, darling. You look awful when you're exhausted. James gave a small smirk as he approved the transfer. Every dollar she took, every act of violence she committed, was another piece of evidence, another explanation for what was to come. He opened his laptop and started typing his daily journal, recording every interaction and transaction. He was constructing each piece of the puzzle. Richard and Rebecca believed they were writing the last chapter of his story. They were unaware that they were merely preparing for their own demise. The lab was silent, but for the buzz of equipment and the subtle clicking of keys as James worked outside. The city resumed its never-ending rhythm. Unaware of the storm gathering beneath its surface in high-rise offices and luxury penthouses, people like Richard Sterling engaged in power and privilege games, considering themselves untouchable. They were about to discover how mistaken they were. James glanced at his watch. It's nearly midnight. In a few hours, he had a breakfast meeting with Dr. Patterson to finalize the acquisition terms. Following that, a series of meticulously organized meetings would set the next stage of his strategy into motion. He turned off his computer and gathered his belongings. His motions are deliberate and leisurely. There was no reason to haste. Everything was going perfectly as planned. Richard and Rebecca had taught him significant lessons about patience, timing, and the nature of power. It was now time to demonstrate that he had been an excellent student. The morning after signing the divorce papers, James sat in his small apartment, surrounded by 3 laptops that displayed various components of his plan. The first presented Mason Hayes's preliminary findings about Sterling Properties. The second followed Rebecca's rigorous training of their accounts. The third included encrypted files relating to his cancer treatment breakthrough. His phone vibrated with a message from Mason. Meeting in 20 discovered anything significant. James arrived at their regular coffee shop ahead of schedule and chose a corner table with a clear view of both entrances. Mason rushed in, his eagerness apparent despite his efforts to keep a professional tone. "You won't believe what I discovered," Mason stated as he opened his laptop. "Sterling has been using the same homes as collateral for several loans. Look at this." He flipped the screen, which revealed a sophisticated web of transactions. He takes out a loan with property as collateral, then uses the same property to secure another loan from a different bank. The documentation is modified just enough to escape instant notice. James inspected the diagram with a neutral look, noting Rebecca's involvement. "She has been quite helpful," Mason replied, bringing up further documents. "As a loan officer for First National, she has been pushing through bogus applications and manipulating documentation. I've identified 12 properties that have been used as collateral more than once. We are talking about hundreds of millions in bogus loans." "Evidence?" Mason nodded. "Plugging in a secure drive. Everything is here. Loan applications, property assessments have been altered. Income statements were falsified. Rebecca's fingerprints are all over it. She wasn't only assisting Richard, she was actively involved in the deception." James digested the information in his thoughts, already planning his next movements. How about Richard's previous projects? That's where things become interesting. Mason leaned forward and lowered his voice. "Remember the luxurious apartment construction he's been talking about? The one at the former industrial site? The environmental effect studies were concealed. The soil test revealed unsafe amounts of pollution. However, they paid inspectors to look the other way." James's phone vibrated. Rebecca texted that she had located more of your study equipment in the garage. We'll have it hauled away tomorrow. Consider it gone. He ignored the warning and focused on Mason's findings. How long does it take to assemble everything into a formal report? Give me 2 weeks, Mason responded. But, James, we have to be careful. Sterling has contacts in the municipal council, the planning department, and the judiciary. Let him keep his contacts, James urged. His voice called. They are only loyal while the money is flowing. What happens to rats once they realize the ship is sinking? After Mason had left, James placed another call. Isabella Martinez answered the first ring. Tell me you have something excellent, she remarked as a hello. Better than good, James responded. How would you want to break the most significant real estate corruption story of the decade? They reconnected an hour later in a quiet park. Isabella had not changed since they last met, still carrying her battered notebook, still had that eager gaze that distinguishes all strong investigative reporters. Everything you need is here, James explained, handing her a secure drive. Reports on environmental infractions were suppressed, as was evidence of bribery given to local authorities. Prioritize the Riverside condo project. The pollution cover-up will attract people's attention. Isabella examined him closely. This is thorough, James. How long have you spent acquiring this? Long enough, he said. The question is, can you use it? Oh, I can use it. Isabella's eyes glittered. However, Richard Sterling has friends at the newspaper. They have already killed reports about him. Not this time. James reassured her. This story will not merely appear in your newspaper. It will run concurrently in 3 main outlets. I've already made the necessary arrangements. Isabella lifted her eyebrow. You've been busy. You've no idea. Back in his flat, James examined PharmaCorp's acquisition documentation. Everything was proceeding as planned. Dr. Patterson had obtained board approval, and the lawyers were finishing the specifics. $500 million, enough to make business-related headlines. Enough to show Rebecca and Richard exactly what they attempted to throw away. His phone vibrated again. Rebecca sent another text. The landscapers require an additional $20,000 for the new watering system. I have already approved it. Do not work too late, sweetheart. You look awful when you're exhausted. James gave a small smirk as he approved the transfer. Each withdrawal, each casual slur, was an additional piece of evidence, another nail in the coffin. They were building for themselves. He unlocked his protected laptop and began to update his daily log. Everything was documented. Every single transaction, encounter, and piece of proof. Richard and Rebecca believed they were dealing with a defeated guy. 2 people who have been broken by betrayal fight back. They were about to discover how mistaken they were. A notification flashed up. Mason had sent an additional batch of documents. This time, it was evidence of Richard's contacts with local officials, payments made through shell firms, and advantageous zoning decisions. Permits were expedited. James had underestimated the scope of the corruption network. He forwarded certain documents to Isabella, knowing she'd comprehend their significance. He saved the rest for later. Ammunition to be utilized at precisely the appropriate time. His telephone rang. Doctor, Patterson, James. The board wants to expedite the announcement. They are thrilled about the technology. Now, he stated firmly, we keep with the original chronology. Everything has to happen in the proper order. Does this have anything to do with your ex-wife or Richard Sterling? James stopped, selecting his words carefully. Let's just say timing is critical. Trust me, Catherine, when this is completed, PharmaCorp will not only have a novel cancer cure, you'll have eliminated a potential competitor before they even realize they're in the game. After hanging up the phone, James accessed the security footage from his laboratory, right on schedule. Rebecca appeared and used her key to enter the facility. She went directly to his office and spent 20 minutes photographing documents and downloading information. Of course, the computer she was using was a ruse, filled with out-of-date research material and intentionally false results. The true discovery was made elsewhere, safeguarded behind encryption that would make government agencies envy. A new email has arrived. Rebecca and Richard, the private investigators he had hired, took surveillance images during their regular Wednesday night rendezvous at the Madison Hotel. They appeared triumphant, celebrating their victory over cocktails at the hotel bar. James saved the photographs in his evidence file. Allow them to celebrate. Let them believe they had won. Their arrogance would make their downfall even more spectacular. He switched to another laptop and reviewed Mason's most recent findings. Richard's empire was not only built on fraud, it was a massive pyramid scheme. Each new project was supported with loans secured against existing properties, which had already been used as collateral several times. More importantly, Rebecca was not a passive participant in the scam. She was a crucial enabler. Her status at First National had enabled Richard to obtain loans that would not have been granted otherwise. She had fabricated documents, distorted appraisals, and concealed due diligence studies that may have revealed the plan. James began to create a thorough timeline of their activity, cross-referencing dates and transactions. Their treachery offered him significant lessons about patience, timing, and the nature of power. It was now time to demonstrate that he had been an excellent student. James came at Farmer Corp's offices early on the morning the transaction was set to be announced. Dr. Patterson had insisted on taking a leadership role in the research section, recognizing not just his great mind, but also his strategic thinking. His new workspace, which overlooked the metropolitan skyline, was a long cry from his small lab at Biotech Solutions. However, he was not content with the luxury. It was the knowledge that within hours, Rebecca and Richard's carefully crafted world would fall. The press announcement will be issued at 9 o'clock, Dr. Patterson said as he entered his office, holding a tablet that displayed the final version. Are you prepared for this? James nodded, going over the document one last time. The figures were astonishing. $500 million for Biotech Solutions, including a committed research budget of $200 million over the next 5 years. More than enough to generate headlines. More than enough to challenge some people's perceptions. The board wants you to hold a news conference next week. Dr. Patterson added, your discovery has the potential to revolutionize cancer treatment. People will want to hear from the mastermind behind it. Make a schedule, James responded, but make sure it follows the quarterly profit reports for banking companies. Dr. Patterson raised an eyebrow, but did not question the timing. She discovered during the last few months that James Morrison never did anything without a cause. The announcement went live at 9 o'clock. James watched as the news spread across financial networks, and his phone started to ring with notifications. First came the congratulations from colleagues, then come the investment analysts who want to comment. Finally, just on schedule, Rebecca sends an increasingly urgent SMS. We need to speak, James. Kindly call me. This isn't humorous anymore. Did you plan this? He left each message unanswered, concentrating instead on financial news coverage. The acquisition was widely seen as a big coup for PharmaCorp. Their stock price has already risen in response to the announcement. A knock on the door stopped his thoughts. Thomas Wright, Richard's largest investor, waited in the doorway. His fine suit and gold cufflinks failed to conceal his obvious uneasiness. Do you have a moment, Dr. Morrison? Wright asked, his typical assurance, notably absent. James motioned to a chair. His expression is neutral. Of course, Mr. Wright. What can I do for you? Wright fidgeted with his cufflinks. A worried tell that James saved for future reference. I've heard some alarming reports about Sterling Properties. There are irregularities in the books. There is a possibility of fraud. Given your past with Richard, I figured you might have some insight. I'm afraid I can't help you, James said, his voice professionally detached. I'm just a scientist who lucked out with a medical discovery. Real estate is not my area of expertise, please." Wright leaned forwards. Desperation seeped throughout his voice. "I have invested $50 million in Sterling's most recent development. If you know anything, ask Mr. Sterling these questions," James proposed. "Alternatively, he can contact his loan officer at First National. I believe you know her," Rebecca Morrison writes, and her face pales slightly at the mention of her name. "Yes. Thank you for your time, Dr. Morrison." After Wright left, James called Mason. "Thomas Wright just paid me a visit. Make certain that our friends at the SEC receive the documents on his role in the Riverside project, particularly the portions concerning the contamination cover-up." Mason replied that he was already done. The dominoes are beginning to fall. This morning, James and 3 other investors pulled out of Sterling's initiatives. James finished the call and went to his computer to look up the most recent report from his investigative team. Richard's empire was starting to show fractures. Banks had questions about collateral. Investors demanded audits, while environmental groups held protests at his construction sites. His phone buzzed again, this time with Isabella's call. She stated unequivocally that the tale will begin tomorrow. Front page and entire spread. "We received confirmation from 2 other sources. They are running it concurrently. Is there any opposition from Sterling's newspaper friends?" They tried. Isabella's joy was clear in her tone, but when the editor saw the evidence of polluted soil and hidden reports, he couldn't dismiss it. The liability would have been too high. James smiled slightly. "Good. Make sure the sidebar mentioning First National's engagement is prominent. Banking regulators should find it fascinating." The remainder of the day was a blur of meetings and interviews. James executed his duty flawlessly. The talented yet humble scientist concentrated entirely on the potential for his medical innovation to benefit people. Nobody imagined that he was also arranging the downfall of a real estate enterprise. Later the afternoon, another visitor arrived. Richard's lawyer, David, excelled. The man's normal, smug smile had been replaced with barely hidden panic. "Mr. Sterling wishes to explore a settlement." Sean started attempting to project confidence. "He is willing to be generous." James leaned back in his chair and studied the lawyer with cool amusement. "What is the settlement for?" "Mr. Chin, I am not suing Richard. I am not doing anything to Richard. I am simply a scientist who has created a potential medical cure." We both know it's not true. Chin's veil of professionalism crumbled slightly. These anonymous tips to authorities, the abrupt investor outflow, and the environmental demonstrations. It all began following the divorce. "Correlation does not indicate causation," James explained calmly. "Isn't this what attorneys constantly say? Now, if you will excuse me, I need to meet with our research team." As Chen departed, James received another text from Rebecca. "Do you think you are clever? Richard has pals in high places. They will bury your valuable study and harm your reputation." James forwarded the note to his lawyer, who added it to the growing collection of evidence. "Allow them to make threats. Allow them to fight back." He anticipated every move and was prepared for every eventuality. The phone rang again. Mason has additional updates. The dominoes were falling faster. 2 banks had blocked Sterling's credit lines and demanded quick audits. Environmental inspectors had issued stop work orders for 3 large projects. Investors filed lawsuits. James closed the call and stood at his window, gazing out at the city. Rebecca and Richard were out there, watching their carefully planned world crumble. They believed they were the architects of destruction, but they were about to learn a bitter lesson about the consequences of underestimating their opponents. As his business crumbled, he launched a desperate counteroffensive, beginning with a violent smear campaign against James. Breakthrough scientist accused of research theft. The headline screamed from local news websites. A former Biotech Solutions employee came forward and claimed James stole the innovative cancer cure research from him. James read the piece with clinical detachment in his PharmaCorp office, noticing the cautious wording that fell just short of actionable libel. Richard had strong, expensive lawyers, but they were fighting a war James had planned for months. "They're pushing the story hard," Dr. Patterson stated, entering his office with a worried expression. "The board wants to know if it's true." James turned his computer screen toward her and displayed a series of video logs. Each step of the research is documented here. Daily diaries witnessed by impartial witnesses, equipment readouts, and trial data are all triple backed up. He opened up another file. Here's the fascinating part. Mr. Chin, the whistleblower, discovered Dr. Marcus Webb checking his bank records during the last week. Dr. Patterson's eyes widened as she examined the records. $800,000 was deposited 2 days ago by a shell firm tied to Sterling Properties. Richard is becoming sloppy, James noticed. Desperate people make blunders. His phone vibrated. Isabella Martinez Webb's credibility has been shattered, she claims. "We discovered 3 previous cases in which he sold false testimony in patent disputes. Most media outlets have already retracted the story. Make sure the retractions mention the Sterling shell payment as James instructed, and copy everything to the SEC investigators." Sarah Zhang, his lawyer, called him shortly after he terminated the call with additional news. "Rebecca's lawyers filed a motion to reopen the divorce settlement," she said. "They claim you concealed the true value of biotech solutions throughout the proceedings." James allowed himself a slight smile. "Perfect. Send them the response package." The response package was a meticulously prepared document that had been waiting for just this moment. It included detailed records of Rebecca's systematic training of their joint accounts, as well as evidence of her involvement in Richard's fraudulent loan schemes and an attempt to steal and sell James's research data. "There is more," Sarah continued. "They claim she helped the company succeed by providing emotional and financial support. They want a percentage of the acquisition price." "Interesting approach," James responded. "Send the surveillance footage from the laboratory, the videos of her breaking in to steal research data, as well as the documented transfers that show how she drained the company's accounts. Don't forget the time-stamped photos from the Madison Hotel. Let's see how a judge handles her claims of support." The next few days were a blur of legal maneuvers and counter-maneuvers. Richard's attorneys filed motion after motion, each one more desperate than the last. James handled each attack with calm precision. Always one step ahead, armed with damning evidence, ready for deployment. "They're getting desperate," Mason said in their daily update. "Sterling attempted to move assets offshore last night. We caught it and stopped the transfers. The banks are closing in." James nodded, reviewing the most recent financial data. "And Rebecca. She has been placed on administrative leave at First National. An internal audit revealed anomalies in her loan approvals. They are now cooperating with regulators." A knock on the door interrupted their talk. Dr. Patterson entered, carrying a tablet. "James, Richard Sterling is in the lobby. He is demanding to see you." "Perfect timing," James replied, standing. Mason forwarded all we had about the Riverside project to the EPA. "It's time to speed up the chronology." "Are you certain you want to see him?" Dr. Patterson inquired. Her voice conveyed concern. James said, "I wouldn't miss this for the world. Have security ready, but let him go." Minutes thereafter, Richard Sterling stormed into the office. His fine suit crumpled, and his usual pristine appearance revealed indications of tension. Dark rings appeared under his eyes. Betrayed. His hands trembled slightly as he pointed at James, indicating a lack of sleep. Richard snarled. "You smug bastard! Do you think you are so clever with your tiny schemes? I built this city. I own half of the people in it." James Romaine sat with his posture relaxed. "Richard, you are owned. Past tense. It's remarkable how quickly loyalty fades when the SEC starts asking questions. This is about Rebecca, right?" Richard laughed. However, there was an element of hysteria to it. You're destroying everything I've accomplished because your wife decided to trade up. No, Richard, James said gently. This is about repercussions. You and Rebecca believed you could steal everything from me, break me, and humiliate me. You never considered that I might fight back. Fight back? Richard's voice soared. You aren't battling. You are wrecking lives. My investors, projects, reputation, and your dishonest loans. James interrupted. You are buried. Environmental reports, bribes to city authorities. Richard, did you really believe you could juggle all those balls forever? Richard's cheeks turned pale. How did you know everything? James stood slowly. I had known for months every scam, fraud, and double dealing. I saw you and Rebecca celebrate your victory as I gathered evidence. I let you believe you had won while I planned to take everything from you. I will annihilate you, Richard threatened. However, his voice lacked conviction. I have connections, James corrected. Check your phone, Richard. The EPA has just announced a probe into the Riverside project. The FBI is executing search warrants at Sterling Properties offices throughout the city. Your connections are rushing for cover. As if on cue, Richard's phone started buzzing relentlessly. His face turned pale to ashen as he read the messages. You're finished, Richard, James whispered gently. Your empire is falling. Your investors are running. Your banks are calling in their loans. And Rebecca, she is going to discover the penalty of disloyalty. Security arrived to remove a shell-shocked Richard out of the building. James watched him leave, feeling frigid contentment rather than triumph. The actual endgame was still to come. His phone vibrated with a message from Isabella. Stories will go live in all major outlets tomorrow. FBI raids, EPA probe, and banking fraud. It is everything coming out. Want to make a comment? No comment was required, James replied. The evidence speaks for itself. He returned to his computer, analyzing the remaining components of his strategy. Richard and Rebecca had taught him significant lessons about ruthlessness, timing, and the nature of power. They would now learn the cost of such teachings. The ensuing days would see federal investigations and indictments in the total collapse of Sterling Properties. However, James never intended to get revenge. It was about justice delivered coldly and methodically. He took out a framed photo from his desk, the last one shot of him and Rebecca together, smiling at a charity event. He fed it into the shredder. I watched as their frozen smiles turned into confetti. The game was almost over, and James Morrison had executed every move brilliantly. James Morrison sat in his PharmaCorp office, watching multiple screens as the meticulously planned annihilation of Sterling Properties unfolded. FBI agents rushed the company's headquarters, hauling crates of paperwork and hard drives according to another screen. Richard Sterling's face twisted with wrath as federal officials escorted him through his own foyer in handcuffs. The raids are coordinated across 6 locations. Mason said that his laptop displayed a map with blinking red dots. They are simultaneously targeting the offices of all Sterling Properties. There is no risk of document destruction. Isabella's exposé was published that morning on 3 major news outlets. The headlines were catastrophic. Fraudulent real estate enterprise. Sterling Properties is a labyrinth of corruption, environmental crimes, and financial fraud. The downfall of Richard Sterling. James's phone rang with a message from Dr. Patterson. Board meeting in 20 minutes. They'd like an update on the new research facility. Tell them I will be there. He responded, remaining focused on the screens. Rebecca was led out of First National Bank, according to the raid film. She attempted to flee, deleting data and shredding documents when the investigators arrived. But James had anticipated the maneuver. Every file, transaction, and piece of evidence had already been backed up and sent to federal authorities. Mr. Morrison. His assistant's voice came over the intercom. Agent Sarah Chan of the FBI is here to visit you. Send her inside. Agent Chen entered her FBI windbreaker, which was still dusty from the raid. Dr. Morrison, I appreciate your participation in our investigation. The evidence you supplied was valuable. James motioned to a chair. I am merely a concerned citizen, Agent Chen. When I discovered proof of financial fraud and environmental problems, I was obligated to report it. A concerned citizen who happens to be the ex-husband of one of the main suspects, Chen observed, analyzing his reaction. A coincidence that Miss Morrison's lawyers will undoubtedly try to exploit. James responded calmly, but the facts spoke for themselves. Fraudulent loans, environmental cover-ups, and bribery. None of this is related to our divorce. Chen nodded and pulled out her notebook. We discovered something fascinating in the early search papers, which revealed Miss Morrison accessed private research data from Biotech Solutions following your separation. Any thoughts on that? That would be a problem for my lawyers and the patent office, James explained. I am sure you understand. I cannot comment on potential industrial espionage while the investigation is ongoing. The agent grinned faintly. Of course, it is interesting that evidence surfaced just as we were preparing our case against Sterling Properties. Life is full of interesting timing, James responded. Now, please excuse me. I have a board meeting to attend. After Chen left, Mason called with updates from his contacts in the financial industry. It is a carnage. 3 banks have called in their loans. Sterling's whole house of cards is falling. They cannot meet even 10% of their responsibilities. James opened his laptop to check the latest financial data. Sterling Properties stock had been halted from trading after plummeting 60%. Investors were launching lawsuits by the hour. Construction areas remained abandoned as contractors evacuated the sinking ship. His phone vibrated again. A communication from Rebecca's attorney. My client is willing to testify against Mr. Sterling in exchange for consideration by prosecutors. She was simply following directions. James deleted the message without completing it. Rebecca's attempts to preserve herself were foreseeable but unsuccessful. The evidence trail he had created linked her too deeply in the scam. Every loan application she accepted, every document she falsified, and every bribe she enabled was painstakingly documented and reported to authorities. Dr. Morrison, he used his assistant's voice again. You received a call from Thomas Wright. Put him through. James Wright's voice sounded frantic. You have to help me. The SEC has frozen my assets. They claim I knew about the environmental problems and fraudulent lending, didn't you? James interjected abruptly. The Riverside Project stands alone. Contaminated soil, endangered species, habitat destroyed, falsified, environmental impact studies. Your signature appears on everything. Thomas, I will testify against Sterling. I will tell them everything. Goodbye, Tom. James ended the call and returned to his displays. The news coverage was increasing. Drone footage captured environmental demonstrators at Sterling's development sites. Former employees were coming out with additional evidence of malfeasance. Political friends scrambled to disassociate themselves from the issue. A notification flashed up. Another communication from Rebecca. You had this planned all along, didn't you? Well, we assumed you were broken, destroyed, you were real. James archived the message without reading any more. Allow her to know the reality now. Allow her to understand exactly who she betrayed. Dr. Patterson entered his office without knocking. The board meeting can wait. James interrupted, pointing to his screens. Watch this. Live coverage shows Richard Sterling being escorted into the FBI headquarters. The once proud real estate developer seems crushed. His costly suit crumpled, and his carefully cultivated image crumbled along with his enterprise. You orchestrated all of this, Doctor, Patterson remarked calmly. It was not a question. I just presented proof of unlawful activities to the appropriate authorities, James responded. Everything else is simply cause and effect. The timing, waiting until after the transaction had been disclosed, until Rebecca's attempts to reopen the divorce agreement. James turned to face her. Catherine, The research is real. The breakthrough is legitimate. Everything else is simply cleanup. She gave him a long look. You're not the man they assumed you were. No, James agreed. They made me the guy I am today. His phone vibrated again. Isabel Martinez. Federal prosecutors are moving quickly. Grand jury indictments are expected within days. They charge for everything: bank fraud, wire fraud, and environmental crimes. Conspiracy. James answered, keep me posted. And Isabella, make sure your follow-up story emphasizes the environmental components that the public needs to grasp the true damage Sterling's avarice has created. He ended the call and stood by his window, watching FBI officers put more boxes into their cars. Every piece of evidence he'd gathered over months could be found somewhere in those crates. Every phony document, every falsified report, and every proof of Rebecca and Richard's misdeeds were meticulously gathered and stored as they celebrated their alleged victory over him. Mason's voice sounded from his speakerphone. James, you should see this. Sterling is attempting to transfer assets through offshore accounts. Multiple transactions were initiated within the last hour, already reported to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. James responded. Observe what happens on one of his screens. Numbers started flowing. Accounts are frozen. Transfers were reversed. Assets were seized. Richard's desperate attempts to conceal his unlawful earnings were thwarted in real time. How did you know? Mason asked. Because that's exactly what I'd do, James explained. When people like Richard and Rebecca feel imprisoned, they become predictable. They follow patterns. All you need to do is predict their movements. His assistant's voice interrupted. Dr. Morrison, Rebecca Sterling is in the lobby. She is demanding to see you. James checked the security feeds. Rebecca stood at the reception desk, her luxury clothing and flawless makeup setting a stark contrast to her frenzied demeanor. Have security escort her outside. He asked me to email the lobby film to my lawyer. Let's go. Trespassing on her expanding list of worries. He returned to his screens, watching as more dominoes fell. Sterling Properties. International partners were severing relations. Construction lenders called in their loans. Environmental agencies were issuing stop work orders for a variety of projects. The research facility plans are now ready for assessment, Patterson explained, placing a tablet on his desk. The board authorized the increased funds. James nodded, looking over the plans for the new cancer research institute that would emerge from the ashes of his previous existence. The symmetry was perfect. The house where Rebecca and Richard had planned to destroy him would become a sanctuary of healing, growth, and hope. Sometimes, he continued gently, the finest revenge isn't simply annihilating your adversaries. It uses their annihilation to create something better. Dr. Patterson looked at him seriously. You never wanted to simply walk away, did you? Even in the beginning, they felt I was weak. James responded. They believed I was defeated. That is the trouble with folks like Rebecca and Richard. They are so sure of their own superiority that they never realize the truth until it is too late. His phone vibrated one last time. Agent Churn. Dr. Morrison, we discovered something unusual in Miss Sterling's private files. Documents indicating she intended to sell your study data to a competitor. Would you be willing to give a statement? Of course. Agent Churn, James responded, a frigid smirk flickering across his lips. I am always happy to assist federal officials. He ended the call and returned to his displays, seeing his years of well-planned corruption shatter in a single day. Richard and Rebecca had taught him vital lessons about power, betrayal, and the significance of being weak when you were actually strong. They would now have to spend years learning the consequences of underestimating their opponents. The federal courthouse hummed with tension as James passed through the security checkpoint. His testimony was slated for day 3 of the Sterling property controversy, as reported by several media sites. Reporters lined the steps, cameras blazing as he walked inside the courtroom. Richard and Rebecca sat at separate tables, with their legal teams forming a physical barrier between them. Richard's sleek appearance had degraded. His fine suit hung loosely, and he had black circles under his eyes. Rebecca kept up a stronger appearance, but her hands trembled as she stacked documents in front of her. All rise. The bailiff, identified as Judge Miranda Chin, entered the courtroom. James took his position in the witness box. His stance is comfortable and assured. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Williams approached her shoes, which clicked on the glossy floor. Please provide your name for the record, Dr. James Morrison. Dr. Morrison, what is your current position? I am the Chief of Research and Development at PharmaCorp, where I manage the development of targeted cancer treatment technologies. How do you know the defendants? Rebecca Sterling was my wife for 15 years until we divorced. Richard Sterling was once her real estate client before becoming her lover and then husband. Rebecca's attorney jumped up. Objection. Your Honor? Relevance. It aims to prove the witness's awareness of the defendant's activities, Williams countered. Overruled, Judge Chin declared. Continue. Miss Williams. The prosecutor systematically guided James through his testimony. He discussed detecting financial issues, fraudulent behavior patterns, and environmental infringement. Each claim was substantiated by thorough documentation, bank records, loan applications, internal memos. In addition, there are environmental impact reports. Williams held up a hefty binder. Could you please explain their significance? These studies described hazardous pollution at the Riverside development site. James explained that Sterling Properties buried them and submitted false information to acquire building permits. David Chun, Richard's lawyer, tried to undermine him during cross-examination. Isn't it true, Dr. Morrison, that the whole probe springs from your desire for vengeance? No, James responded quietly. It is based on evidence of various federal crimes. My personal relationship with the defendants just made me more aware of inconsistencies in their business operations. However, you waited until after your divorce to bring these claims forward. I reported everything to the appropriate authorities as soon as evidence was discovered. The timing of their probe is entirely up to them, not mine. Patricia Martinez, Rebecca's lawyer, took a different strategy. Dr. Morrison, is it feasible that my client was not aware of the full scope of these activities, that she was simply following Mr. Sterling's orders? James turned to confront Rebecca directly. Your client has 15 years of experience as a loan officer. She directly approved the false applications, falsified papers, and worked with Mr. Sterling to obtain additional loans with the same collateral. These actions necessitated competence and deliberate intent. During recess, Isabella Martinez cornered him in the courthouse corridor. They're breaking apart in there, she noted. Rebecca's team is already communicating. Please deal. Let them negotiate, James responded. The evidence speaks for itself. The experiment ran for 3 weeks. Former Sterling Properties employees testified to systematic document destruction, hidden environmental reports, and sophisticated kickback schemes. Bank officials described a complicated web of fraudulent loans. Environmental experts provided proof of irreparable damage to protected wetlands. Richard broke down first under harsh cross-examination. He attempted to transfer blame to Rebecca, alleging she was behind the loan fraud plot. Rebecca replied by producing recordings of Richard discussing bribery to city authorities. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours. James remained very still while the forewoman read the verdicts. Guilty on all charges: bank fraud, wire fraud, environmental crimes, conspiracy, money laundering. The federal marshals led them away. Rebecca caught James's eye for the first time. She saw him clearly, not as the meek husband she had discarded, but as the architect of her downfall. The realization, in her opinion, was more valuable than any spoken confession. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded him. Dr. Morrison, how did you respond to the verdict? Justice was served, he said simply. The evidence was conclusive. Do you feel validated? James said that this case was not about personal vindication. It was about holding people responsible for their misdeeds. The jury considered the evidence and made its conclusion. Back at his farm, Dr. Patterson waited with a bottle of fine scotch. She noticed an impressive performance in there. You never lost your composure. There was no need for emotion, James explained, accepting the glass. The facts were sufficient. Mason's phone buzzed with information on asset seizures, Sterling Properties. Holdings was undergoing liquidation. Investors filed civil cases, and banks foreclosed on properties throughout the city. 1 year later, James was standing on the lawn of his previous home. Construction equipment encircled the land, preparing to transform it into a cutting-edge research facility. Dr. Patterson approached holding building plans. The renovation committee authorized all changes. We'll have 20 research stations, a shared lab area, conference rooms, and a lecture hall. James nodded, studying the property and the grant applications that arrived frequently. Young scientists are conducting exciting cancer research, genetic problems, and uncommon diseases. This is the type of effort that typically struggles to secure funding. Approve them all. James gave instructions, full money with no ties attached. His phone broke. Isabella informs him about Richard and Rebecca. Their appeals were refused. They were serving their sentences at separate federal institutions. Their request for leased security placement was denied due to the intricacy of their activities. You know, Dr. Patterson explained carefully. Some folks believe you went too far. You could have stopped once the acquisition was publicized. James observed a group of graduate students walking the grounds. Their excitement was evident as they discussed research possibilities. He said, "They chose to destroy my life for their own amusement." They needed to understand that actions have repercussions. He gestured to the students. See what happened. A groundbreaking procedure that will save lives. Opportunities for young scientists. A corrupt developer is uncovered. Sometimes excellent things emerge from dark places. Rebecca and Richard are serving 12 to 15 years. Richard's cellmate seemed to be immensely fond of him. James allowed himself a slight smile. Life has a way of balancing the scales. They walked back to their cars. James is experiencing not joy, but fulfillment. He lost his wife, but acquired something more significant. The realization that he was stronger than anyone had expected, capable of both immense success and dreadful retribution. The research facility would be his legacy, not the vengeance he had exacted, but the good he had accomplished with it. This was the final lesson, the one Rebecca and Richard would never comprehend. True power lay not in destroying things, but in creating something meaningful from the damage in their respective jail cells. Rebecca and Richard would have years to reflect on their folly of underestimating the quiet scientist whom they thought they could destroy. The cost of betrayal had been considerable, but the benefits measured in lives saved, discoveries made, and justice served would be much higher. James started his car, taking one last look at the grounds that had witnessed both his humiliation and triumph. The past was settled, the future loomed, and somewhere in federal prison, two people who had taught him about cruelty were learning about the consequences of their actions. Epilogue. 5 years later, James Morrison changed his tie before giving the keynote lecture at the International Cancer Research Symposium. Through the backstage curtain, he could see Dr. Patterson in the first row. PharmaCorp now has a chief medical officer, beaming with pride. Their personalized cancer therapy approach outperformed all expectations, with survival rates tripling in previously untreatable instances. And suddenly the announcer's voice echoed throughout the auditorium. Please welcome Dr. James Morrison, whose groundbreaking and targeted drug delivery has transformed cancer therapy worldwide. As James entered the stage, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Mason Hayes provides his monthly update on the history that refuses to be buried. Rebecca Sterling, inmate, Shutter 247896, has been denied release for the third time. The parole board emphasized her lack of genuine remorse and ongoing attempts to downplay her involvement in the fraud scheme. She'd aged considerably in federal prison, her fancy clothes replaced by standard-issue khaki, and her finely manicured hands had become rough for required work detail. Richard Sterling had not done much better. Inmate 247895 spent his days at a different federal institution. His frequent appeals exhausted his attempts to retain his rich lifestyle while incarcerated, and he continually maintained that his prior political contacts had abandoned him. His letters to erstwhile associates were returned unopened. James began, "The key to progress." His speech is about making scientific achievements more accessible to everyone. He gestured to the screens behind him, which depicted the Mawson Research Institute, his former home, turned into a bustling research center. There are now 25 young scientists working there. Their projects fully funded their discoveries, which have already saved lives in the audience. Isabella Martinez collected notes for her latest book. Her exposé on the Sterling property fraud earned her a Pulitzer Prize, beginning her career as a top investigative writer. She now ran her own news website, focusing on corporate corruption investigations. James went on to say that 5 years ago, we promised to revolutionize the landscape of cancer therapy. Today, I am pleased to inform that we have exceeded that pledge. He made no mention of Rebecca's attempt to reach him again this morning. Her most recent letter, like all the others, was marked "Returned to Sender" without being opened. She tried everything: apologies, explanations, and requests for assistance with her appeal. James had stayed silent, allowing her words to go unanswered in her prison cell. Dr. Patterson handed him a tablet with the most recent news following his speech at the reception. Richard's former biggest investor, Thomas Wright, had recently pled guilty in a separate fraud case. His attempt to restore his empire following the Sterling incident resulted in additional criminal indictments. "Did you know?" Dr. Patterson inquired. Mason pointed out certain inconsistencies in Wright's new venture 6 months ago, James responded. The SEC received an anonymous tip, which took care of the rest. The Morrison Research Institute has just accepted its 100th grant to support research into uncommon genetic illnesses. The scientific community took note. 3 Nobel nominations had resulted from research conducted at its laboratories. Meanwhile, Rebecca spent her days at the jail library, reading every article about James's success. Her attempts to take credit for sponsoring his early study had become a running joke among the guards. Her prison therapist highlighted her refusal to accept responsibility for her acts, as well as her ongoing belief that she was the victim. Richard had a distinct approach to jail. He attempted to publish a book portraying himself as the victim of a cruel ex-husband's intricate vengeance plot. No publisher would touch it. His previous real estate allies denied they hadn't heard of him. The environmental damage caused by his projects had taken years to remedy. The polluted soil at the Riverside complex necessitated a large cleanup effort. The protected wetlands he destroyed were gradually being restored using the revenues from his seized possessions. Mason Hayes turned his involvement in exposing the Sterling fraud into a thriving business investigation firm. His organization specialized in detecting financial crimes, with a particular emphasis on real estate fraud. He continued to send James regular updates on Rebecca and Richard, knowing that his friend enjoyed being informed. The future of medical research, as James closed his address, lay not in corporate revenues, but in allowing brilliant minds to seek groundbreaking discoveries. The audience erupted with deafening applause. Young scientists from the Morrison Institute applauded their mentor. Many of them had heard rumors about the facility's background, including the personal drama that led to its establishment, but James never mentioned it. Later that evening, in his penthouse office at PharmaCorp, James examined the most recent reports that the cancer treatment system had been approved in 30 additional nations. The Morrison Institute was growing, with a new wing for advanced genetic research. His own fortune had risen dramatically as a result of the PharmaCorp acquisition and subsequent breakthroughs. His phone buzzed Isabella with more information. Richard's former lawyer, David Chun, had been disqualified from practicing law due to his involvement in concealing environmental breaches. Several city officials accused in the bribery affair had completed their terms and were released. Their careers and reputations were devastated. The incident prompted significant adjustments to real estate development and banking laws. New legislation mandated tougher environmental reviews, stronger fraud prevention measures, and greater openness in property transactions. Isabella's reporting landed her a place on the governor's corporate crime task force. Rebecca's daughter from her first marriage, now attending college, she legally changed her surname. She distanced herself from her mother's crimes. She'd sent James a letter thanking him for financing her scientific scholarship with an anonymous donation. He never responded, but he continued to track her academic progress. Richard's ex-wife had written a scathing memoir about their marriage that detailed years of financial manipulation and emotional abuse. The book had become a bestseller, prompting Wright to consider a streaming series. Richard's attempt to prevent the publishing was denied by jail officials. James's new home, a contemporary mansion with a view of the city, contained no reminders from his old life. The only memento was a single-framed news item announcing the Sterling property scandal verdict, which hung in his private study, not for vengeance, but to remember. Dr. Patterson visited him in his office, carrying early data from their most recent trials. "The new delivery system is producing even better results than expected," she stated. "We are seeing complete remission in situations that were previously thought hopeless. James instructed that the trial be expanded. I want this treatment to be available to everyone, regardless of ability to pay." His phone vibrated again. Mason's final update for the day revealed that Rebecca had been caught attempting to run an investment scheme from prison, using contraband phones to contact potential victims. Her parole prospects, which were already weak, were now non-existent. Richard had suffered a mild stroke, and his health was deteriorating due to the stress of imprisonment. His appeal for transfer to a minimum security facility had been denied yet again. The once proud real estate billionaire limped along prison corridors with a cane, avoiding other inmates who knew his story. The Morrison Institute had established itself as a light in the scientific community, with its reputation for pioneering research expanding year after year. The mansion that had witnessed James's humiliation now saw everyday advances in human understanding. "You know," Dr. Patterson said while analyzing the trial results, "sometimes I think about the day you accepted our offer. If Rebecca and Richard hadn't betrayed you, James simply said, 'Everything has consequences.' They selected their way. I chose mine." He turned to his window and looked out at the metropolis where Richard Sterling formerly wielded such influence. The corrupt empire had disintegrated, and the wreckage had been converted into something helpful to humanity. It was a different type of vengeance, more encompassing than any prison sentence. Years passed, yet the lessons remained. Rebecca and Richard had taught him about betrayal, darkness, and the human condition. He had taught them about consequences and the dangers of underestimating people they thought they could annihilate in their respective prison cells. They have years to consider these teachings. James had pushed forward. His achievement serves as a daily reminder of their folly. They had attempted to write the end of his story, not realizing they were really writing the beginning of their own demise. The cost of betrayal had been considerable, but the benefits measured in lives saved, discoveries discovered, and justice served had proven even higher. James sometimes reflected the best. Revenge was more than just eliminating your adversaries. It was about creating something great from the ashes of their betrayal. The sun sank over the city as James returned to his work, focused on the future, while the architects of his past sat in their cages, forgotten by everybody save those who wanted to remember the cost of their betrayal. Here's the next story. Thomas silently climbed the stairs. With the bouquet in hand, an unsettling silence fell over the house. His heart beat as laughter echoed through the bedroom. He froze at the door, staring through the tiny opening. There she was, his wife, intertwined with someone he knew all too well. The flowers fell, the petals scattering like shards of his trust. Her shocked yell rang out, but he did not shout or cry. Instead, he turned silently, leaving behind his keys and the life he believed he was living. "You've made your decision," he whispered to himself. He gripped the steering wheel with frigid calm as he drove into the night. Thomas parked his black vehicle outside the modest suburban home that he and Hannah had proudly acquired 3 years prior. He couldn't wait to tell everyone about his recent promotion at the tech firm. He stepped onto the porch and realized the lights were turned off. An unusually dark early evening. Thomas, confident in his abilities to surprise her, took a tiny bouquet of Hannah's favorite lilies and discreetly opened the door with a grin. He imagined her ecstatic reaction when he announced the career milestone. He had no idea that behind the closed windows he would be in for a completely different surprise. Inside, there was a disquieting silence in the hallway. Hannah would normally be in the kitchen or living room tonight, either playing music or re-watching her favorite culinary show. Nothing. Thomas held his breath, puzzled by the silence. Then he heard quiet whispers coming from upstairs. The hair on his arms dripped. Who might she be talking to? He wondered, cautiously going across the hardwood floor. While climbing the stairs, he felt a dull thump in his chest, an ominous beating that made him swallow hard. Each stride seemed heavier. He imagined that he might accidentally interrupt the talk. Thomas hesitated at the partially opened bedroom door. Muffled laughter and murmured words. Definitely not an innocent conversation. He put one hand against the frame, his mind flying across the narrow gap. He saw Hannah in a way he had never imagined, entangled with a man who was clearly not him. The man's face was hidden, but Thomas recognized his broad shoulders and familiar watch. Horrified, he learned it was a common acquaintance with whom they had enjoyed numerous dinners and laughter. Thomas felt nausea. The bouquet slipped through his fingers, spreading petals across the entryway. "I'm shocked beyond belief." Thomas's first instinct was to scream, but an icy calm gripped him instead. He tightened his grasp on the doorknob for a split second. Then he released it. He turned without saying anything and softly dropped his keys on the entryway table. Hannah's shocked gasp echoed behind him. She yelled his name in a shrill, frantic voice, but he refused to look back. Every second in that house seemed like it was suffocating. He needed air, required distance. He needed to escape the pieces of his broken trust. That stillness, more than any rageful outburst, cut harder than a blade. Thomas ran down the stairs and to his car, fighting the urge to strike the wall. He could hardly see straight. Rage obscured his view. When he reached the driver's seat, he slammed the door and inserted the key into the ignition. "I am having difficulty breathing." The engine roared. He sped away, adrenaline pumping, with no particular destination in mind. He circled aimlessly around the calm streets, angry tears threatening to flow. He had always taken pride in his ability to maintain control both personally and professionally. Tonight, everything he valued had been destroyed, and his entire life had been turned upside down. When his phone rang, he saw the caller ID for Jason, his long-standing best buddy. Normally, Thomas would respond instantly, but this time he let it ring. He pressed his forehead against the steering wheel. Then something within him snapped. "She betrayed me. I am done." He grabbed the phone and called Jason back with shaky hands. "She betrayed me." He mumbled into the phone when Jason responded with concern. "I'm not sure what the details are, but I saw it." Jason's fast intake of air on the other end expressed amazement, rage, and sadness for his friend. Thomas quickly ended the call, not ready to speak. Desperate for a guiding voice, Thomas called Samuel, an older businessman who had been a mentor to him since Thomas interned at a small technology startup. Samuel's steady voice reassured him. "You don't do anything rash, son. Do you hear me?" He spoke as if reading Thomas's swirling thoughts. "If you need to make a plan, do it carefully. Emotions can undermine strategy." Despite his sadness, Thomas absorbed Samuel's remarks. The older man's calm demeanor had always been important in business dealings. This was the most personal situation Thomas had ever faced, but strategy could be his only anchor. In the days that followed, a few so-called friends attempted to dismiss the infidelity as a mistake or error in judgment, which only fueled Thomas's rage. Where were they while Hannah was creeping around? Why hadn't someone told him? Some even attempted to bring them together to clarify their disagreements, arguing that everyone deserves another shot. Thomas took a strong line, cutting off acquaintances who claimed to knowing or suspecting Hannah's adultery, but opted to remain silent if they couldn't show basic respect for him. He thought bitterly that they did not deserve his faith. In a fit of ghoulish curiosity, Thomas started going through phone bills, credit card statements, and odd receipts. He'd previously dismissed the images he'd cobbled together, which made his blood run cold. There were meal reservations he was unaware of, random motel costs, and even questionable Venmo transfers. With each confirmation of Hannah's previous misdeeds, the sadness hardened into grim determination. While a part of him wanted to confront her in a rage, the calmer side, prompted by Samuel's voice echoing in his head, advised him to gather all of the information first. He then told himself, "I shall dispel her illusions." Thomas came to the house once more that week, but only long enough to pack some clothes and necessities into a duffel bag. Every step inside seemed poisoned. He refused to engage with Hannah, who stood in the living room sobbing, imploring, and calling for him. She attempted to clutch to his sleeve, but he shook her off, eyes cold. He would not be moved by tears. Their home was once filled with laughter. As a result of her betrayal, it felt like a mausoleum. Thomas marched out for good, carrying the duffel over his shoulder, never even looking back. Hannah launched her campaign to sway public opinion via a deluge of texts and social media posts shortly after Thomas left. She portrayed him as an angry husband who was overreacting to a minor error. She shared confessional selfies, tears streaming down her cheeks, claiming that the two of them were separated but seeking counseling. Thomas read the updates with increasing disdain. She was attempting to guilt him into returning by portraying herself as the injured party, which is an age-old ploy. A flood of support from naive followers poured in, asking Thomas to give the marriage another chance. Though Thomas tried to ignore it, he felt a pain every time he watched her twisting their story. He had formerly taken pride in how great everyone believed their relationship was. Hannah's attempts to protect her reputation while smearing him irritated him. She was emailing common friends, telling how he refused to connect and was being childish. She even used the statement, "He left me when I needed him the most." Thomas almost hit his car dashboard when he read that. But instead, he decided to starve her attention. He would not entertain her story. Jason found himself in the midst of the chaos. Their shared network pressed him to save the marriage, but he stood by Thomas. Occasionally, he received frantic calls from Hannah, who was sobbing about Thomas's refusal to talk. "And it's hurting both of us." Jason never passed along these communications. He loathed seeing the two at conflict, but he was deeply devoted to Thomas, who had made it clear that he was finished. Despite this, social pressure was great. People begged Jason to intercede as if he could wave a magic wand and reverse Hannah's betrayal. Regardless of the hubbub, Jason's first goal was to assist Thomas. Samuel's advice was conveyed through a brief text paper. Everything, So Thomas started painstakingly amassing proof, including screenshots of her social media rants, printouts of her public pronouncements, and files containing any unusual bank transactions and phone data. It was no longer only about heartbreak. It was about putting together a solid case in case Hannah tried to alter the facts in court. One morning, while sipping black coffee in his modest, leased studio, Thomas realized how vital these measures really were. He remembered Samuel's business teachings. Facts, not emotions, are your weapon and shield. The words reverberated in his mind, fueling his determination. As the stories spread, it became evident Hannah had allies. People like Alice, an old co-worker who seemed eager to conceal or sugarcoat the affair. Whenever Thomas encountered them, they were uneasy, stammering, and saying phony platitudes. He realized that those courteous grins were hiding tongues that had known the truth for months. The animosity permeated every contact in that social circle. Although it stung, he realized that loyalty was not something to be required. It was something earned. He regretted naively trusting the people, but it strengthened his desire to cut links and protect himself. Thomas ignored Hannah's constant messages. He turned off, reviewed receipts, blacklisted her on several apps, and instructed Jason to deny any requests on her behalf. He wondered if she cared during an especially lonely evening. She would not have cheated in the first place. While emotional anguish raged within him, he maintained a stony exterior. Hannah became enraged by this refusal to participate. She left him a slew of voicemails, swinging between sobbing sorrow and burning wrath. Thomas let them to collect, periodically listening for possible evidence but never responding. Thomas secretly scheduled a consultation with a prominent divorce attorney, Bernadette Castillo. She explained his legal rights, suggested solutions, and requested he collect more hard evidence. You must consider alimony asset division. Bernadette emphasized the legal repercussions of trying anything desperate. Thomas's jaw tightened, and he despised the thought of giving Hannah another money or allowing her to cling to the life he had created. So he made his decision right there. No half measures, no dragging out second opportunities. If Hannah wanted to continue fighting, he'd meet her in court, thoroughly prepared. Michelle, Hannah's younger sibling, or possibly a family acquaintance, depending on which relative was recounting the story, called Thomas late one evening. "She is in horrible shape," Michelle remarked haltingly. "We are worried about her. Will you ever return home?" Thomas closed his eyes, visualizing Michelle's innocent concern in her voice. After a pause, he replied, "I can't promise anything." She crossed a line that cannot be erased. The finality in his tone caused Michelle to sigh, a vibration of grief flowing through the phone. Thomas felt sympathy for Michelle, who was completely innocent in all of this, but he refused to be deceived by Hannah's pity chain. Hannah attempted a huge gesture, sparking a second argument. Following Thomas's transfer in the IT company, she arrived at the parking lot, tears streaming down her face, and stood by his car. She cried about wanting to rectify things and insisted that he meet her halfway. Thomas's face hardened. "You made your decision," he continued, his voice icy as a winter draft. When she attempted to grab his arm, he stepped away. Her desperate sobbing echoed in the dark glow of the security lights as he drove away, leaving her slumped in the parking lot. Thomas returned to his studio and glanced at the barren walls. He placed down his phone, took a deep breath, and finally allowed himself to experience the grief. But as tears approached, a surge of rage told him that he couldn't afford to be vulnerable. "No more tears for her," he screamed in a strong voice that echoed in the calm area. He channeled his wrath into a vow. He would become stronger and more tactical. He'd shred every deceptive trick Hannah threw at him. From this moment forward, he lost any softness he had for her. It was time to devise a plan for ultimate severance. At Jason's suggestion, Thomas engaged a private detective recommended by Samuel the detective, Andrea Barnes, a discreet ex-cop who specializes in infidelity cases. Andrea's charming smile and professional demeanor impressed Thomas. She described her procedures for following Hannah, checking public records, and studying phone logs. Within days, she discovered a trove of questionable activity. Andrea passed Thomas images and timesheets as they met in a tight diner booth. "We have enough to prove the affair beyond a doubt," she said, her voice sharp. Thomas scanned images of Hannah in intimate parts of the city with her partner. His chest constricted, but he simply nodded grimly. Meanwhile, Thomas used his technological knowledge to surreptitiously monitor Hannah's phone logs and text messages. His coding abilities enabled him to piece together her contact patterns with her partner, a rival in Thomas's professional network. Day by day, he saw new messages appear, some laced with tenderness. Others provide logistical specifics, such as "meeting me after your meeting." Each ping crushed his heart while also strengthening his determination. This was not a drunken one-night stand or a mistake. Each line of code represented a planned and ongoing treachery. Thomas experienced less sadness and more cold desire to make things right. Andrea spied on places Hannah frequented. One day, the detective took a series of photos. Hannah is sobbing to Alice, her co-worker turned accomplice. Onlookers could have assumed Hannah was sorry. However, the text that followed revealed her whining about Thomas's unreasonable behavior. Alice nodded sympathetically and advised Hannah to keep her partner close, just in case. When Thomas saw those images, he knew how tangled the web of betrayal truly was. Old acquaintances had given Hannah alibis, covered for her, and urged her to continue the romance. The shock was deeper than any single act of cheating. Thomas was enraged when he discovered Alice's involvement and nearly smashed his phone. But he remembered Samuel's motto, "Convert pain into strategy." So he drew a detailed design on a notepad late at night. He labeled it "Scorched Earth," even though it would be perfectly lawful. He wanted Hannah cornered, so she couldn't represent herself as the victim. That entailed accumulating not only explicit proof of adultery, but also any evidence of questionable finances, social treachery, and anything else that might come up in court. Thomas refused to become a raging madman after losing everything in the divorce. He wanted to win decisively. Andrea's next big discovery proved the betrayal of several mutual friends who had served as Hannah's support system for months. They'd organized secret gatherings at their homes and gave Hannah phony identities for nights out. Some were neighbors who had previously borrowed sugar or sought Thomas for assistance. Thomas noticed their concealed cruelty. This information emphasized a dismal truth. The deception spread beyond Hannah, infecting individuals he had trusted. No wonder none of them warned me, he reflected furiously. He felt used and vulnerable. However, that sensation strengthened his determination. He resolved to rid his life of these facilitators. Samuel stopped by Thomas's studio one evening, noticing the stress on his face. Samuel rubbed his chin thoughtfully, saying, "You're out for blood. I see it in your eyes. But please listen. Do not let bitterness break you. Concentrate on the plan." Thomas breathed slowly. He respected Samuel too much to ignore his advice. "I'm just furious," he acknowledged. "So many folks took me for a fool." Samuel nodded. "Anger is normal. Remember, your true power lies in your ability to remain calm. Revenge done cleanly ensures that you leave with a clear conscience." Thomas took the older man's advice, intending to remain calm. In a private conversation, Jason stated that he'd had a nagging feeling for a while but had never summoned the confidence to approach Hannah. He was afraid of losing his friendship with Thomas or inciting Hannah's wrath. "I should have told you something felt strange," Jason mumbled, blushing. Thomas's expression tightened slightly, but he saw Jason's shame was genuine. He considered cutting Jason off for a moment, but then reconsidered. Their bond dates back decades. They had been college roommates and best men at each other's weddings. "I won't forget that you remained silent," Thomas replied quietly. "But perhaps someday I will be able to forgive," needing to conceal his motives. Thomas had a wait-and-see attitude in front of mutual acquaintances. When Hannah's name came up, he stopped spouting fury and pretended to soften. He let the rumor mill spread the idea that he might calm down. Eventually. Hannah seems to hold out hope after hearing these whispers. She backed off. The social media sob stories, which suggested that Thomas was on the verge of reconciliation. It was a superb ruse. Thomas had a steel heart inside, yet he appeared to be uninterested on the outside. This respite was just what he needed to plan the following stages in his retaliation. Thomas put half of his finances into a separate account with Samuel's help. He liquidated some shares to ensure immediate access to funds. He suspended shared credit cards so Hannah couldn't run up expenses on his account. After quietly discussing matters with Bernadette, his divorce attorney, he ensured that Hannah would be forced to rely completely on her remaining resources. If she tried anything radical, she'd find the money pantry almost empty. Thomas had no reservations about offering a fair settlement once the divorce was finalized, but he refused to let her drain him during their separation. Andrea gave her final report late one evening. Hannah's partner wasn't a casual fling. He was a direct competitor in Thomas's professional sector, and he had very likely obtained insider knowledge from Hannah. The treachery took on a new level of viciousness. Hannah and her partner have used personal information to potentially ruin Thomas's career. Thomas seethed with disgust at the final revelation. "So it's very personal," he murmured. "They stabbed me in the back, attempting to undermine my accomplishment. This wasn't just a fling. It was an attack on his livelihood. His rage has now found a new target, and he is punishing them both legally and publicly." Thomas made an unexpected visit at the marital house, wearing a neutral expression that concealed his underlying rage. Hannah, astonished, stepped aside to let him in, too stunned to speak. He stated he wanted to speak things out, implying that perhaps they could figure out a solution. He secretly needed time inside the house to seek for additional incriminating evidence. Hannah's eyes brightened up with relief, indicating she had no idea this was a ploy. If she thought he was softening, she may lower her guard. That's exactly what Thomas was counting on. Hannah, her eyes flowing, knelt at his feet in the living room. She sobbed and grasped his hands. "Apologies. I'm sorry. I was confused and lonely. I want you back." Thomas kept his face expressionless, providing only thin-lipped nods and cryptic hums. Every cry she poured increased his contempt. He noticed how fast she shifted from self-righteous to pleading for forgiveness now that she realized he had the upper hand. "Let's see how we can remedy this," he remarked calmly. The words were hollow, yet Hannah held on to them like a lifeline. Over the next 4 days, Thomas searched the house from a dusty storage box in the garage. He discovered documents that had his signature, although he had never signed them. He examined them more closely and discovered a near-perfect imitation of his handwriting. They were some sort of financial paperwork that connected him to suspicious transactions. Tracing them back, he thought Hannah and her partner could have colluded to steal money or harm his credit. A jolt of rage sounded in Thomas's chest. These weren't simply deeds of passion, they were calculated attempts to harm him financially. He photographed each page, intending to show them to his lawyer. The following afternoon, Thomas gave Bernadette the incriminating paperwork. She flipped through them, her eyebrows arched in alarm. Bernadette noted that if she forges your signature on financial papers, this will not be an easy divorce. We could be looking at possible criminal charges. Thomas's visage darkened as Hannah realized she could financially cripple him. She'd underestimated his intelligence. "I'm prepared to take this to court if necessary," he stated. Bernadette nodded. "We'll use it if we have to. Let us be strategic." Thomas experienced a flush of dismal satisfaction. He wasn't simply fighting an unfaithful wife. He was confronting a well-planned conspiracy. Thomas initiated discreet acts of revenge in their common social circles, throwing carefully crafted hints about Hannah's deception. He never completely revealed her. Instead, he dropped just enough hints that acquaintances became intrigued, pushing them to question Hannah's narrative. "Oh, I heard something about strange financial activities," which he casually stated. Or I assumed she was honest, but perhaps I was mistaken. The rumors spread. People who had previously sympathized with Hannah began to ignore her, unsure of the reality. Thomas watched from a distance, carefully undermining her public image. One mysterious comment at a time. Alice, Hannah's former close friend, cornered Thomas in a supermarket aisle. She insisted that he put aside the drama and focus on rebuilding the marriage. Thomas experienced a burst of rage. This woman was aware of the affair but chose not to disclose it. He gave her a stone-cold stare. "You honestly think I owe Hannah anything? After all, what has she done?" His voice sounded as icy as the frozen items behind them. Alice stuttered as her mouth opened and closed. Thomas went away. The voice echoed along the practically empty aisle. "I know you helped her lie." Alice's face lost color, exposing her involvement. Hannah tried to seduce someone in the kitchen one evening. She'd prepared one of Thomas's favorite meals while wearing a dress he previously admired. When he walked in, she attempted to touch his shoulder, whispering, "We can feel normal again. If you could just forgive me." The despair in her eyes was almost sad. Thomas took a step back, as if her contact had burnt, and spoke coldly. He stated, "You take away our desire for cheap thrills. I am not here to be your safety net." The reprimand made her tremble. The old Thomas would have been heartbroken to see her cry. The new Thomas felt nothing but contempt. Hannah soon realized something was wrong. Thomas's odd serenity replaced the tremendous rage she had anticipated. He is not yelling. He's not hurling anything. He isn't even raising his voice. His cold civility sent shivers down her spine. Late at night, she'd tiptoe around him, attempting to read his expression but finding no flaws in his controlled demeanor. Unknown anxiety grabbed her. She'd freed a man who was no longer blinded by love. The sheer tension in the house became a real force, increasing Hannah's terror every day. Samuel paid Thomas a visit for supper and subtly congratulated him on his patience, sipping a drink of whiskey. He said, "Finish it quickly. If you prolong the situation, she will attempt to trap you in emotional chaos." Thomas nodded. He, too, felt the time was right to strike. Hannah's forgeries were enough to destroy her in court, and the affair was now well documented. He simply needed the ideal moment to serve her with divorce papers in a way that prevented her manipulations from flourishing. "I'm ready," Thomas murmured, his voice steeled. Samuel grinned approvingly. Hannah was supposed to attend a high-profile charity event that weekend, which was ironically supported in part by Thomas's business transactions. "It'll be an ideal stage," Bernadette advised. "Serve her documents in front of witnesses. She is unable to twist the story. If half the town realizes the truth." Thomas curved his lips into a faint smile. It was time for a public reckoning. It was time to expose her in front of the very people who had formerly praised their perfect marriage. He imagined the expression on her face. The shock and shame. It would be a small taste of the misery she had caused him. At the local charity dinner, the large ballroom was alive with conversation, music, and clinking glasses. Hannah arrived with her partner in tow, both wearing glossy smiles. She donned a sleek evening gown, attempting to convey dignity. Their presence oozed hypocrisy. Both had helped to wreck Thomas's life, but they waltzed in like royalty. Unbeknownst to them, Thomas had planned his own theatrical entrance, dressed in a sharp suit. He slipped in unseen at first, surveying the crowd to find their exact place. Each heartbeat raced with expectation. Tonight, illusions would collapse. Hannah's chat was interrupted in the middle of a phrase when Thomas appeared in the center of the gathering. She locked eyes with him. Her blood is turning to ice. Guests separated, creating an accidental circle around the estranged couple. Hannah's lover, flanked her side, appeared shocked, like a deer caught in headlights. The anxiety was apparent enough to drown out the surrounding talk at a steady, measured pace. Thomas approached them with a folder in one hand. Every move carried a silent threat of revenge. He hardly glanced at the lover, instead fixing his cold gaze on Hannah without hesitation. The first page read, "Thomas extended the manila folder. File a divorce petition." Hannah's eyes widened in terror. Her lover looked over her shoulder and swallowed hard. The crowd's silence deepened. The band's music faltered. Thomas spoke calmly, yet his voice cut through the air. "We're finished. These are your documents." A ripple of surprised whispers spread over the ballroom. Hannah's cheeks turned pink, and her composure broke in front of bystanders. She stammered, looking for an answer. Meanwhile, her boyfriend paled, searched the room for an exit. Thomas spoke briefly to the onlookers. "I am sure you have all heard whispers about our marital issues. Here is the truth. Hannah decided to have an affair with a man who attempted to damage my career. I'm calling it quits openly and permanently." The quiet became absolute. A few gasps cut through the tension. Some visitors sipped their champagne nervously, unsure whether to intervene or simply observe the scene unfold. Hannah's gaze darted about, seeing her social capital dissolve with each syllable. Thomas's voice remained calm, conveying the cold authority of a businessman presenting a decisive decision. Hannah became desperate. She gripped Thomas's sleeve. The voice was quivering. "Please, I swear it is finished with him. I was weak. I made an error." Tears ran down her cheeks, but Thomas remained unimpressed. Her final attempt at a public plea for mercy merely added to the spectacle. In a chillingly gentle tone, Thomas responded, "Yes, you made a mistake. One I will not overlook." He shrugged her hand off, allowing her to see the crowd's reaction to the scandal. Every compassionate glance she'd formerly given had turned into scorn or pity. When the dispute escalated, the lover stammered a hasty denial. "I never attempted to sabotage you. It's all twisted." But even as he talked, he took a careful step back, edging closer to the exit. Thomas let him run a scornful tilt of his chin. "He's not worth my time," Thomas said. It was loud enough for everyone to hear. The lover slunk away, effectively confirming his guilt in front of the public. Hannah saw him abandon her, adding to her shame. Guests dispersed, leaving her alone in the center of the grand ballroom. Alice, who had quietly attended the gala, stepped forward to shelter Hannah from the curious crowd. Thomas gave her a stern glance. "You've done enough lying, Alice. I hope it was worthwhile." His scornful tone shocked her. She made excuses, but the audience's focus switched to her culpability as well. She tried to shoo Hannah away from the show, but the harm had been done. People murmured, cell phones recorded, and rumors spread like wildfire. Thomas took a steady stride aside, refusing to let them see any more flashes of emotion. Within minutes, the news spread throughout the event. Hannah, who was formerly a socialite, has become an outcast. Previously, enamored guests avoided making eye contact with her. Sponsors and organizers withdrew. Unsure how to deal with the embarrassment, rumors about her adultery, financial fraud, and sabotage attempts erupted in real time. Thomas had essentially shattered her social position in one deliberate swoop. She couldn't twist the story with so many direct accounts. She was ensnared by her own lies, publicly humiliated, and stripped of all dignity. Some common friends who had previously doubted Hannah discovered the full scope of her betrayal. They apologized to Thomas and admitted they had never believed the reports that he was unreasonable. Others who remained silent or supported Hannah faded like vapor. Thomas, unwilling to confront his rightful rage, strode through the ballroom with unshakable confidence. He felt no satisfaction in humiliating Hannah as he exchanged courteous greetings with significant persons who respected how he had behaved himself. His only relief was that the agony was almost done. Days later, Hannah vacated their marital home due to legal pressure. She had two options: continue paying the mortgage herself or leave. Thomas's counsel had meticulously planned the timetable, ensuring that Hannah was now solely responsible. She couldn't cover the bills on her own, not after being cut off from Thomas's finances and losing her social support. Was she obliged to gather her stuff? Thomas handed up the keys without a goodbye. In one cruel move, he broke their household ties permanently, leaving Hannah with a stark new reality. Back at Bernadette's office, Thomas felt intense joy as she painstakingly prepared for a quick hearing with evidence of Hannah's forgery and documented adultery. The judge is likely to favor with Thomas on issues such as property partition and spousal support. Bernadette insisted on aiming for the throat, if she wishes to contest. "We will pursue potential fraud charges. She will fold," Thomas nodded, suddenly assured. The humiliating scene at the gala had only been the beginning. He sought to make Hannah suffer actual consequences, both socially and legally. During the preliminary hearing, the judge examined the questionable financial documents and scowled, urging caution. He froze the challenged assets until the divorce was finalized. This meant Hannah couldn't obtain huge sums of money without judicial approval. Thomas felt grimly satisfied as he saw the color drain from Hannah's cheeks in court. She had previously gloated, convinced she had outwitted him. The legal system wrapped around her like a vice. She gave him a begging look, but his hard eyes showed no mercy. "You desired this game," he reasoned. "You have now lost." In a desperate emotional ploy, Hannah desired marital counseling. She stood before the judge, her voice shaking, professing she genuinely wanted to mend the marriage. However, Thomas maintained a steady, steadfast tone. He answered, "Your Honor, I will not engage in counseling. The marriage is irreparably ruined." The judge examined Hannah from within. There's no point demanding counseling if one party is completely opposed. Hannah's shoulders sagged. It was a formal admission that her deceitful technique had failed. Publicly, legally, permanently. Thomas was finished. Meanwhile, Jason struggled with regret. He sincerely apologized to Thomas for failing to alert him about questionable indicators earlier. "She threatened me if I said anything," Jason admitted. "I was a coward, dude. I didn't want to see you hurt. Thomas is still injured. I extended a half forgiveness. I appreciate your honesty now, but I will never forget how you kept quiet." Their once unbreakable bond began to fracture. Jason was nevertheless determined to demonstrate his dedication going forward. He assisted Thomas in gathering additional documentation, supported him in court, and rejected Hannah's attempts to sway him back to her side. During a peaceful lunch, Samuel observed Thomas's controlled behavior throughout the legal processes. He clapped Thomas's back. "You handled this with great strength, son. You accepted the blow, turned it around, and did not let it destroy you." Thomas shrugged despite feeling pummeled. The worst of the storm looked to be behind him. "I can't let her bring me down," he stated simply. The older man nodded with a proud twinkle in his eye. He'd seen numerous business protégés fall under less severe pressures. Thomas's resilience stood out, demonstrating both heartbreak and cunning. Hannah, enraged by her legal defeats, performed theatrical antics such as crying in the judge's hallway and fainting mid-conversation to elicit sympathy. But the court officials have witnessed it all before. Thomas remained emotionless throughout, refusing to let her emotional tactics obscure the truth. Her outburst outside the courthouse, with tears streaming as she cried about unfair treatment, reinforced the judge's opinion that she was unstable. Thomas strode right by, undeterred, her pleas ringing throughout the barren corridors. Hannah's financial involvement spread across the local business community. Rumors circulated that she and her lover attempted to sabotage Thomas. The unfavorable news prompted her lover to leave town in quest of a new beginning. Nobody wanted to hire or collaborate with him. The doors crashed in his face. Hannah's circle of supporters has shrunk to nearly zero. She was radioactive. Even acquaintances who had previously given her the benefit of the doubt distanced away, unwilling to be linked with probable deceit. Michelle, whether a family friend or Hannah's sibling, realized that Thomas, despite the abuse he'd undergone, had not devolved into entirely spiteful behavior. He had always followed legal procedures and never engaged in public slander in order to uncover the truth. "I'm proud of you," she said sweetly one afternoon. There are tears in her eyes. "I was concerned that you might become lost in bitterness." Thomas gave a rare smile, moved by her genuineness. Michelle appeared relieved to see him moving forward with dignity rather than drowning in bitterness. Her compassionate remarks reminded him that wonderful people existed, even in this warped situation. The final hearing neared, and Bernadette firmly argued for a fair settlement. Hannah tried to weep on the stand, telling a sob story about why she cheated and forged documents, but her outburst only fueled the judge's skepticism. In contrast, Thomas delivered calm, fact-based testimony. He presented records, SMS transcripts, financial statements, and Andrea's detective report. Each component nailed Hannah's coffin shot. The judge nodded solemnly throughout. Thomas, clearly persuaded by the evidence, maintained an unwavering focus on the facts. Hannah attempted a final ambush in the courtroom parking lot the night before the crucial court date. She requested a private meeting, yelling about how she would divulge a huge secret if he didn't deal. Thomas did not even blink. He just waved at the oncoming bailiff. "If you continue to threaten me, you'll be spending the night in jail," he said calmly. Hannah stepped away, tears flowing down her cheeks as she noticed the bailiff's severe expression. Her final gambit failed, and she faced the harsh reality. She didn't have any more bullets. Thomas walked away, leaving her shaking under the harsh fluorescent lighting of the parking lot. When the divorce judgment was finally obtained, Thomas felt a tremendous weight lifted off his shoulders. The judge granted him a favorable settlement, recognizing the gravity of Hannah's crime. She walked away with very little money, nowhere like the opulent lifestyle she'd become accustomed to outside the courts. Thomas took a long intake of clean air. For the first time in months, he felt free. No more illusions, no more manipulative demands, and no more legal entanglements that linked him to Hannah's toxicity. In the days following the ruling, the toll of the months-long battle became apparent. Thomas reported physical weariness, headaches, insomnia, and occasional nausea. Every muscle in his body tightened, as if bracing for a blow that would never come. He recognized that, while he had won legally, the emotional scars were profound. However, each morning as he pulled himself out of bed, he realized that he was no longer involved in Hannah's betrayal. The relief was bittersweet, but it was a step towards true recovery. Samuel, ever the supportive mentor, prepared a modest victory celebration at a secret lounge that only Jason, a handful of genuine friends, and a few business allies attended, raising glasses to salute Thomas's new beginning. He felt thankfulness pour over him. There were folks who actually had his back. He had lost many acquaintances along the road. He realized who was real. Jason, appearing somber but honest, toasted him to a man more powerful than any betrayal. Thomas managed a modest grin and clinked his glass. It wasn't a joyous occasion. It was more of a sigh of relief. Later that night, Thomas returned home and carefully flipped through old wedding photos preserved in a dusty album. Each photo showed him and Hannah exuding an aura of everlasting affection. He felt a familiar sting, then made one determined motion. He ripped the images from their protective sleeves and threw them into a garbage bag. His memories of Hannah had become poisoned. Getting rid of these mementos was cathartic, a symbolic cleanse of what she had represented. When the bag was tied up, his heart felt a little lighter. I'm determined not to find fulfillment only in the workplace. Thomas and Samuel worked on a side project together. They set their sights on a local tavern that has the potential to become a popular microbrew establishment. Thomas focused his strategic mind on branding, marketing, and financial forecasting. Instead of concentrating on the terrible memories of the past, the project helped him to channel his energies into something constructive. With each stride, he recalled the terrible lesson of trust. He promised to maintain rigorous boundaries in business relationships, guaranteeing that no one could simply mislead him again. Late at night, Thomas frequently found himself in peaceful thought. He'd drink a single whiskey in his leased apartment, letting recollections to flash across his head like ephemeral shadows. Heartbreak had hardened him, developing an edge he had never realized he possessed. He worried that he had become too cruel. But then he remembered how Hannah had tried to ruin him emotionally, financially, and socially. That reminder silenced any guilt. Through the betrayal, he discovered a steadfast part of himself that refused to disintegrate. Jason, feeling apologetic, promised to assist with the new venture. He spent his weekends hauling supplies, planning promotional events, and debugging programming for the bar's website. Despite Thomas's politeness, there was a perceptible barrier between them. He no longer revealed his deepest fears in Jason. The trust was shattered, and Thomas suspected it would never fully heal. Nonetheless, he recognized the honest attempt. Perhaps in time, they will be able to restore shards of their old friendship. For the time being, Thomas remained emotionally cautious. Hannah's financial difficulties were known. The rumor was that she lived in a tiny flat, unsure of her next payment. Former friends avoided her, viewing her as a social outcast. Some pity her, others said she earned every hardship, following the stunt she pulled. Tom has received these updates with cold detachment. He no longer took pleasure in her misery. He was merely relieved that she could no longer cling to his achievements. This is her punishment, he reminded himself, and I had no role in causing it. She did it herself. Michelle will be with Hannah's sister or a young family friend who has come by the new bar. One afternoon, she marveled at the sophisticated decor and expressed her delight that Thomas was doing well. "I was worried about you," she said, setting down her iced tea. "You went very silent for a time." Thomas grinned quietly, admitting that he had withdrawn into himself to withstand the assault of treachery. "I'm fine now," he said, noticing genuine relief in her eyes. In a way, her attention represented a delicate lifeline of normalcy amid the insanity of his previous life. A chance phone contact from an old acquaintance triggered the next step in Thomas's future. The acquaintance indicated a significant business opportunity, applauding Thomas's tenacity and increasing local reputation at the bar. Thomas was intrigued and agreed to meet. Unbeknownst to him, this would be the catalyst that catapulted him into even bigger chances, ones he would not have explored if his personal life had stayed comfortable and complacent. The irony was not lost on him. Hannah's betrayal, while terrible, had eventually driven him to become a stronger, sharper version of himself. A new chapter waited, beckoning him to continue without looking back. Weeks passed, and the pub, now rebranded Eclipse Lounge, acquired popularity among locals and weekend visitors. Between Samuel's business savvy and Thomas's marketing genius, word spread quickly. Customers enjoyed the modern feel, craft cocktails, and an upcoming microbrew menu. Thomas spent his evenings conversing with customers who expressed real appreciation for the relaxed atmosphere. Each great evaluation felt like vindication, confirmation that he could rebuild something solid from the ruins of his previous existence. He'd see his reflection in the bar mirrors and identify a reborn guy. Thomas's colleagues at the software firm grew to respect him more. They had heard reports about his terrible personal life. Instead of crumbling, he ventured into a second firm and dealt with hardship calmly. He had also blocked Hannah's lover's sabotage attempts during coffee breaks. Co-workers remarked on his remarkable perseverance. Thomas remained humble, quietly rejecting compliments, but inwardly he felt validated. His career skyrocketed because he refused to let heartbreak define him. Nonetheless, he remained on guard. Thomas did occasionally see a therapist on Samuel's recommendation. At first, he dismissed the concept of therapy, associating it with weakness, but after a few sessions, he observed minor improvements. He slept better, felt less prone to outbursts, and found it easier to plan ahead. The therapist pushed him to confront the grief rather than bury it. It was hard at times to recall the moment he discovered Hannah in bed with another man. However, each recall chipped away at the emotional garbage. He gradually began to feel relief from his dreams. Fate planned an unexpected encounter with Hannah. One average Tuesday at a neighborhood grocery store. She appeared unkempt while searching through produce. Thomas spotted her before she noticed him. His first instinct was to turn and leave, but curiosity kept him lingering a little too long. She looked up, panicked eyes tinged with desperate hope. Without saying anything, Thomas spun and walked straight out the automated doors. Hannah let out a choking sob, which echoed behind him. He did not look back or speak a single word. The past was over. He owes her nothing. Thomas pursued other interests now that he was free of drama. He took a motorbike class, something he'd always wanted to do but put off during his marriage. He also registered for cooking classes at a local culinary school. These activities, which revealed an unanticipated enthusiasm for experimenting with flavors, reminded him that life was more than boardrooms and tragedy. When he read the motorbike engine or learned a new dish, he felt an invigorating rush, proof that he was truly alive again, free of betrayal. If Michelle was a younger family member, she thrived in the new environment around Thomas. She respected his fortitude, even calling him the strongest man I know. She'd come to the lounge after her classes, joking that she wanted free soda. In reality, she came to suck up Thomas's constant energy, finding it inspiring to see him rise from the ashes. He made time to answer her questions about life, heartbreak, and resilience. Their friendship became stronger. Thomas was mildly surprised to discover a silver lining in Hannah's dismal tapestry. Alice, Hannah's erstwhile ally, attempted to extend an olive branch. She sent an apology text. "I apologize for everything. Perhaps one day we can discuss." Thomas glanced at his laptop, remembering how Alice had encouraged Hannah to prolong the affair. "No thanks," he responded curtly. "There is nothing to discuss." He blocked her phone number right away, after realizing that forgiveness had its limitations. Complicity in betrayal was an unforgivable sin in his book. He had no desire to revisit the past with someone who had shown their betrayal. Local journalists quickly realized that Eclipse Lounge has a fascinating background. Its co-owner was a tech professional who had been involved in a high-profile divorce scandal. A journalist suggested a feature article about post-divorce reinvention. Thomas paused, hesitant to make his personal grief become a headline. However, he understood the marketing advantage. He consented to a brief interview centered on the company's achievements rather than the nitty-gritty facts. The ensuing piece went viral locally, portraying Thomas as a rising entrepreneur who survived a personal tragedy. Eclipse Lounge's popularity skyrocketed, and his name became linked with fortitude. Jason, taunting Thomas one evening, said, "Look at you, Mr. Eligible Bachelor. I bet you have ladies lining up." Thomas rolled his eyes, a tiny smirk touching his lips, and a part of him wished for company. Hannah's betrayal left a lasting impression. He shrugged. "I'm not opposed to dating," he admitted. but I'm not sure I'm ready to trust that much yet. Jason nodded, looking around the crowded bar, well aware of the attention Thomas was receiving from curious fans. Jason reminded him that it was time. Simply give it time. Amidst the chaos, Thomas received an invitation from a humanitarian organization. They requested him to propose a new marketing campaign for a citywide youth mentoring program. He consented since he was interested in aiding poor children. It felt like an opportunity to focus his newfound energy into something important. If the pitch is successful, it might boost his professional position even further. More importantly, it has the potential to pave the way for larger developments in both the marketing and philanthropy sectors. Thomas accepted the invitation, experiencing a renewed sense of exhilaration after a long absence. His vista was really becoming lighter. Thomas was connected with a vibrant event designer named Claire as part of the charity effort, renaming, to prevent confusion if Michelle is a family member. Claire was a flurry of activity, effortlessly combining creativity and organizational skills. There was an evident connection between them from the first time they met. They worked together to revamp the program's annual gala, converting it from a drab fundraiser into a colorful community celebration. In late-night brainstorming sessions, Claire admired Thomas's steady leadership. He admired her warm heart and unwavering commitment. Their chemistry suggested something more than just professional respect. They collaborated on a unique plan to transform humanitarian events into multi-tiered marketing experiences that appealed to local businesses, families, and even younger audiences via social media. The synergy was electric. Between ideas, they provided glimpses into their personal lives, with Claire expressing her single status and appreciation for sincerity. Thomas carefully observed the kindness in her eyes. Before they knew it, they were sharing their ambitions, regrets, and future hopes. For the first time since Hannah, Thomas felt pulled to someone's presence beyond friendship. Hannah learned about Thomas's growing relationship through the town's gossip mill. Whether motivated by envy or a desperate need for attention, she attempted to meddle. She sent Thomas a series of nasty text messages, including vague cautions about not trusting new women too quickly and indicating Claire was exploiting him. Thomas blocked her phone without hesitation. He refused to allow Hannah's machinations derail a potential fresh start. If anything, her attempts strengthened his resolve to go forward without her toxicity. Thomas maintained his composure in public when Hannah's name was mentioned. "We're finished." "I wish her well," he'd say. I have no additional comment. This graceful yet forceful posture impressed the philanthropic group, which regarded him as a class act under fire. Meanwhile, Claire admired his restraint. She respected the fact that he did not hurl mud even when provoked. It spoke volumes about his personality. Claire built a silent bond when she discovered he wasn't the bitter, vindictive sort. He was simply determined, refusing to let betrayal define him. Samuel, ever the cautious father figure, noticed a shift in Thomas's behavior while drinking coffee at Eclipse Lounge. He teased, "You've got the look, son. You feel like you're about to do something good." Thomas gave a goofy grin. "She's different. Sam. Smart, kind, and enthusiastic about her work." The older man nodded in approval. "Only, just remember, take things slowly. You have been through a lot. Do not lose yourself." Thomas agreed. While part of him was hesitant to open his heart again, another part was filled with a gentle pleasure at the idea of true company. One evening, Thomas told Jason about Claire. They sat in the back office of Eclipse Lounge, finalizing inventory and spreadsheets. Thomas said, "I'm intrigued, but also terrified of being hurt again." Jason clasped Thomas's shoulder, his eyes filled with regret for previous mistakes. "Do not let Hannah deprive you of a chance at happiness. Claire is not Hannah." That simple sentence resonated in Thomas's psyche. He understood that avoiding future heartbreak did not imply rejecting all future possibilities. Perhaps it was time for him to trust his instincts once more. The philanthropic after-party was held at Eclipse Lounge, cementing the relationship between Thomas's bar and the city's fundraising scene. Claire and Thomas worked together to ensure that every aspect was perfect. Guests poured in, admiring the design, music, and sense of community. By midnight, the fundraiser had surpassed all previous donation records. Standing next to one another on the lounge's little stage, Thomas and Claire declared the final fundraising number to thunderous cheers. In the blaze of accomplishment, their eyes locked, and for a brief moment, the world reduced to just the two of them. Inevitably, an old buddy who had previously sided with Hannah cornered Thomas at the pub. The buddy began talking about Hannah, mentioning the meltdown and how perhaps she has changed. Thomas felt a flash of ancient rage, but swiftly suppressed it. "She's irrelevant," he remarked calmly. "I do not need an update on her life." The companion shuffled uncomfortable. Thomas turned away and sipped his drink. He had no desire to rehash the past. Claire noticed his strained posture and moved over to check on him. Her warm grin relieved the stress, reminding him that he no longer needed to focus on old scars. The night's accomplishment propelled the charity drive to state-level attention. Local news stations covered the story of how Thomas, a former corporate underdog, and Claire, a passionate event planner, transformed a stagnating fundraiser into a record breaker. Their teamwork was praised as a blueprint for future community gatherings. Thomas found himself juggling interview requests, occasionally reliving elements of his own redemption arc, but still uneasy addressing his divorce publicly. He was pleased that the attention was turning to his new accomplishments. He publicly praised Claire's ideas and work ethic over a quiet dinner at a late-night restaurant. Claire admitted she had once witnessed subtle sabotage attempts by a woman who fit Hannah's description. "She tried to corner me, implying that you were domineering and vengeful," Claire claimed. "I didn't believe her for a second, but I didn't want to stir things up." Thomas halted, fury flashing briefly. Hannah attempted to poison the well, but Claire's honesty and loyalty calmed him. "Thanks for telling me," he replied, reaching across the table to hold her hand. The impact of that simple action lingered between them. Even after the betrayal, trust was blossoming. Thomas went down the alleyway late one night after Eclipse Lounge had closed to pick up some rubbish. He almost dropped the bag when he noticed a man collapsed beside the dumpster. Hannah looked pale and anxious. She claimed to be pregnant by her lover, no less, yet she insisted on loving Thomas. Tears streamed down her face as she begged for money and assistance. Thomas stared at the ice in his veins. "You made it clear who you wanted," he remarked bluntly. "That is not my concern." Her sobs filled the tight lane, but he moved away, refusing to be dragged back into her turmoil. The next day, Hannah took a different strategy, hovering near the bar's entrance and sobbing loudly enough for others to notice. She cried about how life had wronged her and how the father of her child had left. Thomas calmly advised the personnel, "She is trespassing. Have security move her along." It was a tough instruction, but he refused to participate. Strangers' pity would not influence her actions. Eventually, the bouncers led Hannah away, leaving just an echo of her sadness. Thomas returned to business, refusing to let her drama overshadow the lounge's success. In a final sweep of any remaining ties, Thomas provided precise orders to the bar's personnel. Some colleagues paused, unsure if denying Hannah or any of her known accomplices admission was too severe. Thomas's face hardened. "This is my sanctuary. I will not have it tarnished by anyone who contributed to my pain." His voice left no space for discussion. The staff nodded, respecting his boundaries. Thomas relied heavily on his sense of safety and control, a sign that his life was no longer vulnerable to intrusions. To his astonishment, the local community rallied around him even more. Regulars in the lounge appreciated Thomas for his hard stance. Hannah's meltdown became widely known. People whispered that he had been through hell and was still standing. A small group of devoted customers even offered to assist Hannah if she caused further trouble. The outpouring of support reminded Thomas that he was not alone, that the community recognized his bravery and admired his unwavering determination. He accepted the goodwill with a humble nod, thankful for every bit of solidarity. Samuel, who met Thomas at a nearby cafe, chuckled in amazement. "You're quite the legend in this town now," he joked while sipping his coffee. Thomas shrugged, slightly embarrassed by the attention. "I never asked for any of this," he explained. "I simply refused to be walked on." Samuel gave a wise nod. Exactly. And the refusal made all the difference. Thomas smiled and internalized the compliment. He'd earned the reputation of a man who refused to be broken, who used heartbreak to propel himself forward. By this point, Thomas and Claire's relationship had developed into something genuine. She saw him not as a scorned husband, but as a man of courage and compassion. On a quiet evening, as they strolled along a scenic riverside, he confessed, "I'm ready to let go of my anger. It taught me strength, but I'm done living in that space." Claire squeezed his hand, eyes shining with understanding. "I want to know you without all that pain overshadowing who you are." The sincerity in her voice made his chest warm for the first time in a long while. He felt real hope for a future built on trust. Hannah's situation reached Thomas's ears again when someone casually mentioned that her ex-lover had indeed fathered her child. Apparently, he'd fled town, leaving her to fend for herself. Some expressed pity for the child stuck in the middle of that mess. Thomas, however, felt no personal regret. He'd tried to make a life with Hannah. She'd wrecked it. Now, the repercussions were hers to bear, with a sense of finality. He realized he no longer felt anger or sadness, just relief that he was free from her tangled web. Jason, in a moment of public sincerity, apologized to Thomas in front of a group of friends at Eclipse Lounge, his closing hour. He tapped a spoon against a glass to draw everyone's attention. "I just want to say," he began, voice weak, "I failed my pal. I let fear keep me silent. Thomas, I am so sorry." Thomas was transferred. He stood, touched Jason on the shoulder and said, "It's behind us. Let's move on." A surge of applause poured up among the small crowd. The bond had shifted, but at least they were rebuilding it with honesty. Claire proposed a collaborative charitable event at Eclipse Lounge, blending marketing savvy with humanitarian zeal. The purpose was to give scholarships for local youngsters, notably those who'd endured severe home conditions. "We can offer them a second chance," Claire stated. "Eyes are sparkling," Thomas enthusiastically agreed, recalling how he had once felt trapped by circumstances. The event's performance exceeded expectations, earning enough monies to support numerous students for each scholarship presented. Thomas felt a sense of bittersweet contentment. He was using his past trials to create something positive and important for others. Rumors circulated that Hannah, unable to rebuild her life in the same community, was preparing to relocate out of state. Some suggested she desired a new beginning where no one knew her history. Others said she was yearning for better career possibilities. Thomas responded to the gossip with a distant shrug. Her departure marked the end of the nightmare, allowing him to return to his daily life. He felt a final sense of finality, as if the last links that bound him to his previous existence had been broken. As the sun fell behind the lounge's neon sign, Thomas exhaled a deep, cleansing breath. He was free. Eclipse Lounge prospered 1 month following Hannah's supposed departure. Loyal customers routinely filled the chairs, appreciating the handcrafted cocktails and welcoming atmosphere. Thomas balanced the duties of the lounge with his work at the software firm, achieving a fresh sense of serenity. His routine, formerly plagued by dread and resentment, was now centered on productivity, creativity, and self-care. The staff liked his even-keeled leadership, especially since he never hesitated to join in where help was needed. Outside of work, you may be bartending, dishwashing, or simply welcoming customers. Thomas's romance with Claire progressed slowly. They found joy in the simplest things: late-night coffees, unplanned journeys out of town, dancing under the couches, and low lights after closing time. She was everything. Hannah had not been faithful, honest, or honestly kind. Their conversations ranged from lighthearted joking about reality TV to serious philosophical discussions about second chances. Over time, the strain that had gripped Thomas's heart subsided, to be replaced by cautious but irrefutable hope. Legally, all links to Hannah were severed. The judge approved the property agreements, and Thomas's accounts were entirely secured in his name. He updated every paperwork, from driver's licenses to insurance plans, to ensure that not a single bureaucratic thread connected him to his former wife. The official closure felt like a second divorce, a final clearing of the decks that allowed him to move forward unhindered. When he signed the final form, he felt lighter, as if a phantom weight had slid off his shoulders. Rebuilding trust in friendships proved more challenging. Jason, despite his real contrition, sensed an invisible wall. Thomas remained friendly, but he rarely welcomed Jason into very personal discussions. Instead, he made new friends within the charitable scene. He assisted a few struggling entrepreneurs in hosting pop-up events at Eclipse Lounge, forging relationships based on mutual support rather than shared history. This new network of people admired Thomas for his honesty and determination. He'd polished his traits via betrayal. If Michelle was a younger friend or cousin, she was overjoyed with Thomas's metamorphosis. She hailed him as a hero for overcoming the heartbreak that previously appeared to engulf him. Thomas chuckled, denying any heroics. Nonetheless, he valued Michelle's perspective. She represented innocence, unspoiled by adult resentment. In a way, her faith in him strengthened his feeling of self-worth. He'd had the biggest heartbreak of his life, but someone viewed him as a symbol of resilience and optimism. He is with the Eclipse Lounge stable. Samuel chose to take a step back from everyday activities. He hinted at enjoying semi-retirement and trying out new pastimes, such as gardening and wine tasting. Thomas took on more leadership responsibilities, finishing expansions such as a small stage for live music and a monthly craft beer festival. Each subsequent addition enhanced the lounge's repute. When Samuel came by, he'd smile broadly and tip his hat in praise. He would reply, "I knew you had it in you." His voice was warm and paternal. Despite his initial doubts, Thomas occasionally considered marriage. Late-night conversations with Claire turned into discussions about long-term goals, home ownership, and shared dreams. She never pressed him. Despite his cautious disposition, there was a subtle hope in the air. Each day, they laid a foundation of trust, making the idea of eternity less intimidating. Thomas allowed himself to envisage a secure connection built on mutual respect rather than illusions and deception. The community that gathered at Eclipse Lounge felt like an extended family. Local bands played on weekends, and a changing cast of food trucks parked outside to supplement the bar's offerings. Thomas sponsored youth events and periodically opened the lounge's rear room for charitable meetings. The same generosity that had previously exposed him to Hannah's exploitation was now being used to help others. During that transition, Thomas gained a greater sense of purpose. He wasn't simply moving on, he was actively creating a more positive environment around him. Late at night, when the lounge was empty, Thomas would lock up and stay under the marquee lights. The letters Eclipse shone softly against the night sky. He would ponder on how far he had come. A year ago, he was a betrayed husband driving aimlessly through the dark. He was now a respected entrepreneur, making real contacts and laying the groundwork for a better future. He felt contentment rush over him, a gentle warmth that convinced him that he was on the right track. This was true happiness, no delusions. There is no fear of fraud. He'd get random business pitches or partnership offers from time to time, including a strange email from Hannah's ex-partner looking for a joint venture. Thomas read it once, scoffed, and deleted it without responding. He wasn't interested in old ghosts. He had other priorities. His successful lounge, developing romance with Claire, and a future full of possibilities. Let the past stay in the past. He had overcome the trauma, emerged stronger, and refused to give up his hard-won tranquility for any transitory illusions. Months later, the city designated Eclipse Lounge as a community pillar. Thomas led marketing activities that benefited underprivileged youngsters, propelling the humanitarian campaign to new heights. The lounge organized book drives, holiday toy collections, and even a scholarship fund in collaboration with local schools. The story had changed from betrayed husband to creative businessman. Thomas's name had become synonymous with resilience, owing to his unyielding unwillingness to be a victim of circumstance. Claire and Thomas celebrated their one-year anniversary with a romantic supper at a charming cafe, accompanied by sips of vintage wine. They reflected on the roller coaster of a year, her hectic event planning life, his divorce catastrophe, and the surprising synergy they discovered in each other. Claire's eyes lit up with candlelight as she thanked him for allowing her to see the guy behind the guarded facade. Thomas, remembering the grief that had once choked him, leaned closer and said, "I didn't think I'd ever be prepared for something serious again. But here we are." Occasional rumors concerning Hannah persisted. Something about her raising a child alone in another state. They no longer made Thomas angry or unhappy. The bitterness had turned into indifference. He realized she was only a part of his story, not the last chapter. He was genuinely relieved that the confines of that unhealthy relationship were no longer controlling his life. He informed Claire one night, "I'm free to be myself without her shadow looming over every decision now that the major traumas have been healed." Thomas acquired a fresh capacity for empathy rather than hardening forever. He shared his experiences with others in trouble. He led a mentorship effort that taught young folks about emotional intelligence, financial literacy, and self-worth. He incorporated betrayal lessons, such as confirming trust while being open to connection, into every interaction. People value his sincerity. He found a measure of salvation in his own spirit after realizing he was speaking from raw, genuine experience when he helped others. Michelle, if she remained in Thomas's orbit, had matured into a confident teen or young adult, wearing the confidence she gained from witnessing Thomas's tenacity. She appreciated his philanthropic efforts and occasionally volunteered at Eclipse Lounge events. Thomas teased her for smuggling her favorite Coke. She teased him that he was becoming soft. Their banter was filled with familial warmth, demonstrating that not all of his connections had been damaged by betrayal. Adversity has the potential to cause good ties to endure, flourish, and even strengthen. During a casual weekend lunch, Jason looked across the table at Thomas and thanked him for not abandoning me. Thomas gave a tiny nod. "We've all made errors. Let us just keep moving on." Despite being tested, their friendship had settled into a new understanding. They made jokes about old college experiences, shook their heads at how life had changed. Hannah's affair left scars that no longer burned. They had, in some bizarre manner, constructed a path to acceptance, but not as innocent as previously. Their link now embodied a revitalized feeling of loyalty. Claire and Thomas began discussing the potential of buying a small home together. They visited a few cozy places to test the waters of cohabitation. For Thomas, crossing that threshold and investing in a shared environment was a significant emotional step. However, each time he imagined a future with Claire, he felt excitement rather than dread. She was neither demanding nor clingy. She merely wanted to create something genuine with him, step by step. He found the steady pace invigorating, in stark contrast to the whirlwind illusions of his previous marriage. The charity drive spread outside the city, attracting attention from statewide organizations. Thomas traveled to conferences to propose marketing strategies that combined corporate support with genuine community engagement. The audience admired his clarity and passion. He described Eclipse Lounge as an excellent example of transforming personal tragedy into social benefit. Each standing ovation informed him that the world admired his fortitude. He was no longer the wounded man who learned of his wife's infidelity. He was a leader and an inventor, forging new paths amid life's darkest betrayals. One afternoon, he received a letter forwarded from his previous address. Hannah had written in the envelope, "Heart is throbbing." Thomas placed it on his desk for a second. Curiosity flared. What could she want? Now he recalled the numerous nights of misery, humiliation, and manipulation. He took a lighter, moved behind the lounge, and lighted the edge of the envelope. The paper curled into ash in a little metal trash can. He never read one word, no more backward glances. He turned and went inside. The last link to her was severed beyond repair. On a peaceful, beautiful afternoon, Thomas rested against the brick wall outside Eclipse Lounge, surveying the busy street with folded arms. Business was good. His group of friends was authentic. A caring companion stood by his side, and the nightmares of betrayal had faded to distant echoes. He took a long breath, relishing the prospect of a life free of dishonesty. This is it. He had a thought. The feeling of a fresh start, a redeemed tomorrow. Betrayal did not break him. It had tested and reforged him, resulting in a sharper, stronger soul capable of accepting the love and success he deserved. Here's the next story. My wife and I had been married since we were 25. We're 38 now. We met in college, got married, and everything has been wonderful. We both graduated, landed nice careers, and began our lives together. My wife and I both made good money, so money was never an issue for us. My wife worked for her father's tiny firm, but I worked for a much larger company. After a few years, my boss unexpectedly departed the company, and they needed someone to take over. The only person who understood how to run the department was me. So I received a significant wage increase, as well as a better bonus and benefits package. The works. So at 28, I was probably making 3 times or more than my wife. My wife gave birth to our first daughter when she was 28, in the same year. 2 years later, we got our second. My wife was able to broaden her professional horizons by working for her father. Approximately 5 years ago, my father-in-law died unexpectedly. That put my mother-in-law and wife in a difficult position. Sell the company or manage it yourself. My mother-in-law had no idea how to run it, so my wife offered to do it. My wife took over the company, and it performed just as well as when her father ran it. Having said that, my wife received a much larger income raise than me. I was proud of her. It is difficult to transition from being a regular employee to owning a business. Anyway, our daughters began to suffer from not seeing their parents. My wife and I discussed whether one of us should stay at home. She remarked, "The company you work for will be fine without you, but mine could fail." I agreed, so I quit my job and became a stay-at-home dad husband. I do everything. I ensure that the females are all taken care of. I cook, clean, mend things, run errands, and do whatever else is necessary. I spoil my wife when she returns home from work. This worked great for a while, until approximately a year ago. My wife always appreciated and loved what I did. Recently, she has been really mean. For example, just asking, "Do you do anything?" Or, "How about you work for real?" What? Every day I work my ass to ensure that you do not have to lift a finger when you return home. I too had a real job before quitting to raise and care for the daughters, our home, and you. Not to mention, my wife is extremely sexual, always has been. She stopped initiating sex, and when I ask, she is never in the mood. That was pretty bizarre. Eventually, I stopped trying. I just assumed that with all of the pandemic-related chaos, she was stressed and it was affecting her. I began to strive harder to make her happy. Nothing ever works. My oldest played softball last weekend, so I prepare everything and we go. During the game, I wanted to record a video for my mother and father, who reside in another state and don't see my daughters very often. I had forgotten my phone, so I asked my wife if I might see hers. She had been attached to it all day, therefore it would be beneficial for her to get off of it. Anyway, she offers it to me and tells me she's going to get a drink and some snacks. She gets up. When a message appears on an app, I record a video of my daughter. I check, and I have no idea what I see. My wife and this guy from her workplace, who is 8 years younger, are sexting and emailing videos and photos, talking about how good the sex was, then me. He's calling me a wimp who can't get a real job taking care of his women, and my wife agrees with him. I could not believe what I saw. I was devastated and outraged all at once. I heard my wife return, so I closed the app and began filming. My wife tries to talk to me on the way home and when we arrive, but I'm not in the mood. We eventually got into bed and tried to have sex for the first time in a long time, I believe. I tell her I'm not in the mood. She responds, "If you are going to be a bitch about everything, you can sleep on the couch." I got up, went to the couch, and have been here ever since. I don't know how to proceed with this. I truly don't know where to start. My wife was everything to me, and my daughters were my life, and now all of it is dying. Any help would be greatly appreciated. I desperately need it. Update number 1. Hello, everyone. I'd want to thank you all for your suggestions. First and foremost, I have all of the text, pictures, and videos. Second, I am not familiar with the company. She and my mother-in-law share equally. Third, I can't sleep in my bed. I've been sleeping in the guest bedroom every night, which is where I'll be staying. To answer, I've chosen to divorce her. Anyway, this morning I called a firm in another town to keep the secret. Thankfully, they were able to accommodate me this morning because someone had canceled. After dropping off my daughters, I drove over there. To cut a long tale short, he is an excellent lawyer. I showed him what I had. He stated that fortunately for me, with the proof I have, she will be pretty well screwed in the divorce. Given that I resigned my work to raise our daughters, she is seldom home, is having an affair, and favors this man over me and my daughters, she will lose easily. He basically stated we'd get child support and alimony, and I'd keep the house, but she'd have to pay for it as long as my girls were there. He also indicated that we may attempt for more money because I am regarded no longer viable in the working world to assist me pay for additional study in order to find work. Some of you were correct. He advised not to work until after the divorce was finalized. He stated that because you are the husband, if you have a job, you may lose a significant portion of this. He asked whether I wanted complete custody. I stated that I don't mind my wife seeing her girls on weekends every now and again, but I wouldn't want mostly complete custody. He argued that because she had an affair in the married house, he could basically do whatever he wanted, since he indicated that bringing a strange man to the house endangers the daughters and makes her culpable. So I'll go for full custody so she can have weekends once or twice a month. No men will be permitted around my girls, and if I discover out, she may face consequences. I simply do not want that POS near my girls. He eventually told her to keep silent until the draft was complete, at which point he would assign someone to serve her and issue an order requiring her to leave the house. He claimed he'd finish it maybe next week. He asked me to keep silent. He added, "I understand how difficult it is and how upset you are, but just shut up until everything is finished. You can say whatever you want about her when the divorce is finalized, but for the time being, keep it quiet." He told me to act normally. He stated no conflicts, no problems, sleep in separate beds, and no sex. I said, "No problem? But why?" He answered, "Trust me. Just don't do it and do what I say." I just got home and began preparing for dinner while also acting and behaving normally. I'll act as if everything is fine until she gets served next week, because I can only make 2 updates here, and yes, I did read the rules. Any additional updates will be posted on my page if anyone is interested. Thank you all for your suggestions, including some hard words, and to the one person who asked for my wife's nudes. Just know, it looks that all you have to do is ask her, and she will send them, so it isn't as difficult as it seems. Quick edit. He suggested that I obtain an STD test. In addition, my girls will undergo a DNA test. When I inquired why, he answered, "Incidents like this are very rare and occur for the first time." So, sure, that hurt and terrified me. Update number 2. I've been feeling sad, and things have been difficult. To begin, I have spoken with my lawyer regarding these posts. I did not delve into too many details. They did warn me that as long as I keep them concise and not very specific, I may post them, but I have to be careful about what I put on to avoid giving away too many specifics. That is it. So, for a quick update, like I mentioned, it will be brief and not very explicit for legal reasons. We'll start with the test. I was able to acquire an STD test for myself and a paternity test for my daughters. I discovered that I happily have no sickness and am completely clear. I wasn't surprised, given that I hadn't had much sex with her in the previous year. Now for the question that I'm sure most of you are asking. The test for my 2 daughters. Am I the father? I will always be their father, regardless of the outcome. However, I am here to confirm that yes, I am their biological father. I have never been happier to know that I am their father. I never imagined I would have to question it. Yet here we are. As for what occurred with my STBX, well, she has left the house and I have been granted complete temporary custody. In the future, perhaps for a time, I will go into more precise detail. However, she is currently out of the house. My lawyer arranged for me to pick up my daughters and ensure that her removal from the family was handled legally. It was not pretty, but that is for another time. She was served at work, and from what I understand, it wasn't pleasant. However, as I already stated, specifics will be saved until another time. My girls understand what is going on. My oldest is aware that we are splitting, and one of her friend's parents divorced for the same reason. She has witnessed what happened to her buddy and does not want us to split. She has been pleading with me to allow her mother to return home. Under the advice of my lawyer, I will schedule an appointment with a child therapist to explain and assist them in understanding. My youngest only wants mommy to come home and misses her. It kills me and makes me feel like a bad father. They undoubtedly despise me now. I often wonder if I should let their mother cheat on me in order to keep the family unit together and my daughters happy. I simply cannot do that. Sometimes I considering an open relationship and simply waiting until the girls are older, but that will not work for me. Plus, I know the girls will notice and dislike the fact that mommy and daddy do not love each other. My ex is currently living with her mother. My mother-in-law has called and asked us to meet. I agreed, and we shall meet at some moment. She didn't ask for details, saying we'd discuss later, but she begged me not to take her granddaughters away. I stated you are a wonderful and caring grandma, and as long as you can keep my girls separate from what is going on between your daughter and me, I see no reason why you should not be able to see them, and I will not remove them from your life. She thanked me, and that was it. My ex has been attempting to figure out us by calling and texting me. My lawyer has put it up so that I can communicate with her in a trackable manner that is just focused on the daughters. No more, no less. So that's everything for now. I'll probably keep updating, and once this is all finished, I'll provide a large update with all of the information I need to be careful about right now. Update 3. So first and foremost, I celebrated Thanksgiving with my STBX and MIL. I did this only for the daughters, and I made it clear to my lawyer that this was not about reconciliation. That was taken care of. First, I met with my mother-in-law prior to Thanksgiving. We met and had a very mutual chat. mostly simply about how we'll treat my daughters afterward. My MIL did tell me certain things about my STBX. I guess my STBX's high school boyfriend cheated on her. I had no idea she was dating anyone. According to my mother-in-law, this guy hailed from one of those families who warned her to avoid him. So one night she caught him with his head under another girl's clothing and his tongue deep in a girl's jewelry box. My MIL couldn't believe she'd do this. She had a couple of boyfriends who she met in college, but she knew they would not last. She claimed that as soon as she met me, she discovered her son-in-law. Says she is deeply sorry for her daughter's behavior and will ensure that she does not interfere with the divorce. Anyway, a couple of days before Thanksgiving, my mother-in-law invited me over for supper with the daughters. I asked, "Will she be there?" She said yes. I stated I couldn't with her there. She expressed her understanding, but requested if we might extend the holiday for the girls one more time. She said, "I know you have a lawyer. Ask them, and if they say it's a horrible idea, I understand." I did, and they recommended to tell your wife via the app because this is just for the girls to avoid any confusion. So I did. She had already contacted me about coming over. She has been pleading with me to see me and the girls. The girls had begged me to see their mother. I swallowed my dignity for my daughters, and we left. It was awkward. My STBX gave our girls a hug and then attempted to hug and kiss me. I simply avoided her and went to embrace my Emil. My STBX pretended to be a husband and wife and attempted to communicate with me. I said yes and no and assisted my mother-in-law in finishing dinner and cleaning up. My MIL is devout and wanted to say a prayer while my STBX sat next to me. I grasped my daughter's hand, and when my wife tried to hold mine, I jerked away. I know that seems silly, but I don't want her to touch me. I am an atheist, but I agree with my mother-in-law because I respect her. Dinner was fine. STBX is again acting as if we are getting married, inquiring about Christmas and trips she wants to take with us as a family. When she revealed this, I realized going over was a mistake. We completed supper and I just got up, cleaned my girls and my dishes and was ready to go. My daughters wanted to see a movie with their mother, which we always do. I let them, and my STBX attempted to cuddle close to me on the couch. Following that, I sat in the chair. My MIL was furious with my STBX the entire night for how she behaved. I could tell from the glances she gave her. The movie concluded, and we began to depart. My daughters had fallen asleep, so I took them to the car. I went in to get something, and my STBX grabbed me in tears, pleading with me to work on things, saying she wants to be a family and is very sorry for what occurred. Before I could say anything, my MIL grabbed her by the hair, yanked her, said goodbye, and began yelling at her daughter. So, yes, I informed my lawyer everything and nothing indicated reconciliation, which you made apparent in your mails. You're fine. Wife is once again calling and pleading to work on us. She is left on red. I will solely talk about the girls, and I am confident they will want to do the same for Christmas. I'm not sure if I can, or if it's acceptable. I will speak with my lawyer again. Update US 4. This won't take long, but things have grown really awful for my girls. My daughters had 2 sessions with their therapist this week. The first one was good. My girls appeared to be in a better frame of mind than normal. I spoke with the therapist afterward, and she appeared to be quite good and understood my daughters well. So I took kids to their second one, and shit is completely fucked. Basically, the therapist explained in age-appropriate terms that the reason their mother and I are separating is that she cheated, had an affair, and betrayed me. I knew she would eventually, but I didn't expect it to happen so quickly. I went to retrieve my girls, and there was practically a rush of tears, with them climbing all over me and hugging me, crying that they love me. I am glad they love me, but this was not what I had hoped for with my girls. I questioned the therapist why she had told them. She stated that the children were aware that you two were separating, and that you appeared to be very nasty and unloving to their mother. Your daughters are not stupid, she told me. They know who you are and how you treat their mother. They wanted to know why you were separating. I tried to walk around it as best I could, she continued, but the girls will not progress in treatment unless we inform them. I won't go into detail about what she said to them, but it was age-appropriate. However, kids are aware of their mother's unfaithfulness in an age-appropriate manner. I believe my oldest could manage this, but not my youngest. So we go home, and my girls refuse to let go of me. They were crying the entire night, so I ordered food, put their favorite movies in my bedroom, and we stayed there all night. They fell asleep, so I went to the restroom and cried. My STBX has no idea how much anguish she's inflicting our girls. I am not sure how I am going to deal with this. The therapist advised me that we may attempt medicine for a while until they adjusted to the new normal. I rejected, which she endorsed, stating that it was only an option since I was not drugging them. Disclaimer: she cannot administer the drugs. She stated that they would need to see their primary care physician, who would most likely diagnose my girls with something that would allow them to be medicated. I would rather deal with my daughter's feelings in a healthy way. My girls despise their mother now, so I won't have to worry about Christmas. How do I know? My oldest stated that she never wants to see her mother again. My youngest listens to what her elder sister says, even if she agrees. I was shocked. I said, "You don't hate her. You may be angry, but you don't hate her. She loves and cares for you." My oldest merely screamed no and wailed into my arms till she went asleep, as did my youngest. So this is how my life is now. Thank you for listening to today's stories. If you enjoyed listening, please like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Also, leave a comment below to share your thoughts on what happened.